For love or money, of all the 7 deadly sins, lust and greed fit together like hand and glove.
She was in the streets as far as like, stripping and making money.
Providing each other's needs on a very basic level.
Valuing love and money equally can blur the line between which is which.
She feels like she was manipulated into this situation.
She would just collaborate with him for money. I don't think she was unaware.
And between what's right and what's wrong.
Right is right, wrong is wrong.
How much is too high a price to pay for love?
People are shooting within the house. People have gone outside and started shooting as well.
I was tracking him down like a dog, pretty much.
And how many lies must we tell ourselves to justify choices we make in the name of money, but are really for the sake of our heart?
Whatever situation was, it could have been prevented.
March 14th, 2016, St. Louis, Missouri. It's just after dark on Natural Bridge Avenue in the city's North Side neighborhood.
Natural Bridge Avenue runs the length of North St. Louis.
This area of St. Louis is known to have a very high crime and murder rate.
Suddenly, gunshots shatter the quiet evening. St. Louis Metropolitan Police's 911 call center is swamped.
One caller doesn't just give the location where the shots were fired, he gives the name of the victim.
The 911 operator instantly recognizes the name, Andre "Dre" Montgomery Jr.
At 21, Dre Montgomery is a national reality TV star.
Dre is the grandson of Robbie Montgomery, star of Welcome to Sweetie Pies. Anyone who watched the show would instantly recognize Dre Montgomery's name.
911 dispatches officers and EMS to the scene. Will they arrive in time to save a youngest member of a show business dynasty? Andre Montgomery was born in San Diego, California, to Andre Montgomery Sr. and Michelle Griggs.
Andre was born on my birthday, October 14th.
But even before his due date, Dre's life was marked by tragedy.
Little Dre was 8 months old when his dad passed away. When Big Dre died, he was murdered.
In the aftermath of the tragedy, Michelle Griggs relocated newborn Dre and her 3 other children to her hometown of Lubbock, Texas.
With what she's been through, Michelle needed the emotional support of her family in Texas.
Family, especially baby Dre, became Michelle's anchor.
Andre and Big Dre share the same traits. Andre looked big image like his dad. In their personalities, always telling jokes, just lively.
He would do something to make you laugh, do something to make you mad.
And just like Big Dre, Little Dre looked out for his family.
He just really cared about his family, so we had a really good relationship.
And Big Dre's family, headed by local St. Louis celebrity Robbie Montgomery, was there for them too.
I really appreciate a lot of things that she would talk to me about, that I had to keep going on regardless because my kids depend on me. She gave me a lot of motherly advice.
Ms. Robbie positively doted on Little Dre.
She spoiled him. She would send him big, elaborate gifts for Christmas. They always knew that the bigger box was for Andre.
I believe Robbie loved him because that was her oldest son, and he looked just like his dad.
Around the age of 7 or so, Andre started to actually go to stay in St. Louis with Miss Robbie for the summer or for certain holidays.
Dre's relationship with his uncle, Tim Norman, proved just as important.
James Timothy Norman is Miss Robbie's second son.
Tim was a positive role model for Dre. Dre looked up to Tim.
With Miss Michelle's blessing, Dre was brought into the St. Louis Sides family business, a successful chain of restaurants, and Welcome to Sweetie Pies, a wildly popular reality show about Robbie and Tim running them as mother and son.
The Welcome to Sweetie Pies show ran for nearly a decade.
She said, we got the show going on, and I've been mentioned by my grandson, and people want to know and meet who Andre is.
Eventually, there was some conversation between the family members, between the Griggs family and the Montgomery family about Andre coming from Texas to stay in St. Louis and finish out high school with Miss Robbie.
You're out of Lubbock. Your grandma's pretty well off, so maybe you have better resources over there that we don't have here.
With his grandma Robbie and Uncle Tim's help, Dre finished high school and became a central character on Welcome to Sweetie Pies.
You had Miss Robbie, who was older, so you had the seniors. You had Tim, who was in his 30s at the time, and you had Charles and Andre, who connected with the younger audience.
Now, St. Louis police are rushing to Andre Montgomery's aid. Outside the house, first responders encounter a young man still conscious, despite gunshot wounds in his arm and upper chest. But it's not Dre Montgomery.
Bystanders had told her that Dre Montgomery has gone back inside.
Police followed a trail of blood that led directly to the dining room.
In the dining room, Dre Montgomery lies face down, bleeding from his chest and lower back.
Andre was pronounced dead on the scene.
What could have happened here? Who wanted Dre Montgomery dead, and why? An epic search for answers will uncover a diabolical conspiracy fueled by greed. Though only 21 years old, aspiring rapper Andre Montgomery had already brought joy into thousands of lives.
Dre was one of the stars of a hugely popular reality TV show, Welcome to Sweetie Pies, alongside with his grandma, Robbie Montgomery, and his uncle, Tim Norman.
But on March 14, 2016, investigators in North St. Louis arrive at the scene to find one man injured and Dre Montgomery dead.
Police investigators see shell casings scattered across the grass in the front of the home, as well as when they enter the home, they see other bullet casings as well as Andre's body.
Detectives discovered one handgun on the kitchen floor, two more alongside a rifle on the bed, and a third handgun on top of the dresser.
Preliminary examination of the shell casings, both inside and out, suggests multiple shooters.
The fact that there was more than one shooter indicates that it's possible this is gang-related.
St. Louis Metro Police interview each of the 7 people in the house at the time of the shootings.
Andre was in a recording session in the basement working on some music tracks.
While in the basement studio, Andre receives that call saying, "Hey, I'm here."
Dre's friends say it sounded like a woman on the other end of the phone.
Dre's friend said he was actually expecting a call, but they had no knowledge of the woman that he spoke to.
Dre then responds to them saying, "I'll be right back." Dre then exits the home alone, and a few minutes later, they hear the gunfire ringing out.
Dre's friends admit that after Dre was shot outside, the second shooting happened inside.
When they heard the shots at Dre, the young man who was in the back bedroom with his 2-year-old daughter grabbed his handgun and started to come out of his room and then proceed through the house to see what was happening. At that point, he sees a gun, and it was dark. Well, come to find out, that was a friend of Dre's who actually was coming up as well to try to defend the people that were in the house. At that point, everyone is rushing into the dining room. People are shooting within the house. People have gone outside and started shooting as well. And Andre, all the while, is laid in that dining room floor.
The young man that police first encountered outside was actually shot inside. And Andre, even though he was discovered inside, was shot outside.
Officers find Dre's wallet untouched and his phone in the vestibule where he apparently dropped it while staggering back into the house.
Clearly, this was not a robbery. It's actually looking like an ambush.
Detectives focus on the phone call that brought Dre out in the first place.
They were able to see the last person that he had spoken to just minutes before his life was taken.
A short time before he was killed, Dre exchanged a series of phone calls and texts with a single contact.
After the police were able to obtain access to Andre Montgomery's phone, they immediately were able to discover the last contact in his phone, which was listed as Alexis the Great.
Dre's final text was the address of the studio. Detectives surmised that Dre's murderer arrived by car, lured him outside with a call, shot him, and escaped the way they arrived.
The bullet casing, the eye and ear witness descriptions suggested that Dre Montgomery met someone outside before being shot.
Was Alexis the Great Dre's killer or just the bait? Detectives contacted Judge to arrange a subpoena for Dre's service provider to reveal just who Alexis the Great is, and in the meantime, there remains the heartbreaking business of identifying the body.
Dre's immediate family was in Lubbock and Tim was out of town, so it fell to Ms. Robbie herself to make the identification.
In Lubbock, Texas, Michelle Griggs answers her phone.
It was 2 o'clock in the morning when I received that phone call from Robbie. And she said the detective they just left here wanted me to go down to the board to identify Andre's body, see if it's Andre.
It was the longest few minutes of her life.
I called my sister and I called my girls and my cousin. I told them, I said, I need to come over right now because Robbie just told me that Andre's dead. So they all came around and we all was praying and hoping that somebody had stole his ID and that it wasn't him. So in the midst of us standing around, she called back. And she said, yeah, it's Dre. At that point, I don't remember what happened. They said I fainted, they said I passed out, I don't know. But I knew that it hurt.
She was in like physical pain, you know. She was non-stop crying. Something I could say or do that would stop her pain. So, you know, that was probably one of the most difficult parts of my life.
When detectives ask Miss Robbie if Dre had been involved in anything unusual, she tells them that not long before the shooting, someone broke into her home.
Because her alarm system had been deactivated, that limited the suspects to Miss Robbie, Tim, and Andre. At the time when her house was burglarized, Miss Robbie was in LA with her son, Tim Norman, while Andre was still in St. Louis, and so they immediately accused Andre of breaking into the house, which he denied vehemently.
Dre's Texas family didn't believe it for a second.
When Robbie's house got broken into, she called me and she told me that she found out that Dre was the one that had robbed her. And I was like, when would Dre rob you?
He's not a thief. He doesn't steal. He'll ask to borrow $20 versus him taking money. He's never been anyone to steal anything from anybody.
Dre had actually returned to St. Louis in order to clear his name with a polygraph test.
Only reason why Andre came back is because he wanted to prove to his grandmother that he loved that he did not do that.
Andre was cleared by the St. Louis Police Department of having any involvement with the burglary based on his polygraph results.
So far, nothing's adding up.
Who want to hurt my brother? Did he get set up? Did he get jumped? Was it for the money? Did he get robbed? Did his friends set him up?
Everything pointed back to the mystery woman who had called Dre just before he was shot.
Police in St. Louis, Missouri are on the trail of an unidentified female who lured 21-year-old rapper and reality TV star Andre Montgomery to his death.
All they have to go on is a series of phone calls and texts from a phone contact, Alexis the Great.
St. Louis homicide digital forensics specialists analyzing Dre Montgomery's phone make a breakthrough discovery.
The final text and calls to Dre's phone from Alexis the Great were made from a burner phone.
It turns out that Alexis the Great had been in contact with Dre in the days leading up to the murder. And she called and texted Dre from an actual registered cell phone.
A new subpoena reveals a name, Terica Tanisha Ellis.
Terica Ellis was an exotic dancer based in Memphis, Tennessee.
St. Louis police contact their counterparts in Memphis.
Memphis police confirmed that Terica Ellis had a pair of vice convictions on her record, but nothing more.
Despite the tantalizing new evidence, police have to play a waiting game. They issue a bolo for Terica Ellis.
We know the last person he talked to, he might not do anything. And that's when I started realizing that St. Louis, had a lot of violent crimes there, so a lot of people was getting murdered as well.
So once they would work on Andre's case, they would get a call to go out to another case. So they'll try to get on top of that one before that one will get lost.
Dre's grieving mother made solving her son's murder her mission in life.
I wasn't about to let him be a statistic, and I told him that. I said he would not be a statistic. He would not be a box that you want to put on the shelf, sit there and get dust without me finding out who did this.
Dre's mother contacted St. Louis police almost daily.
My mom, she kept calling. She would call and call and call. We'll talk on the phone just randomly. I like, hey, Mom, did you call?
I will continue to call. I will continue to pray at night. I will continue to tell God what I want. And if I didn't get the answers, I just kept faith. And I kept calling. And I kept calling.
In her nearly daily calls to St. Louis, Miss Michelle shared something else with police.
Miss Michelle and the rest of Dre's Lubbock family were very surprised by the way that his Uncle Tim had responded after the murder.
When Andre passed, Tim did not reach out to me when Andre passed. Not at all.
And at Dre's Lubbock church service and burial, Tim Norman seemed disconnected.
Tim shook my hand and he looked down when he kind of shook my hand, and I thought that was odd. As a man to man, you look a man in his eyes when you shake his hand. It's just the way I was raised.
But overworked St. Louis police need concrete leads, not suspicions.
When I had talked to detectives, they thought it was just like a little family squabble. They never really paid it to mind.
Tim Norman wasn't even in St. Louis the day that Dre Montgomery was killed, and why would he want his nephew dead in the first place?
For more than 2 years, Dre's family's nightmare of not knowing continues.
My life became just, trying to figure out what happened to my brother, because we, just trying to get the answer. Trying to get closure is what it is. I was just trying to get closure.
And I would call him, and I would talk to him, and I would get the same thing over and over and over. It's a cold case. We can't go no forward.
If that's what it was that'll make me stop hating the world, stop being so dark and stop being so evil, just to see what happened to my brother.
Then, finally, police catch another break. And this time, it might just move the needle. St. Louis Metro Police detectives get a call about the case from a surprising place. Their own system's jail.
Deputies assigned to sift through inmate calls had learned something they needed to pass along.
An inmate held in the county jail was recorded on a phone call with his brother.
The inmate's brother was bragging about how he killed a man for money.
The recording captured Travell Hill laughing about a shooting that earned him $5,000, and he names his victim, Andre Montgomery.
This will be the key to the mystery of Dre Montgomery's murder.
What detectives subsequently discover will put them back on the trail to Terica Ellis. For almost 2 years, Andre Montgomery's murder during a recording session in North St. Louis has gone unsolved.
Dre was shot the day he went outside to meet a woman whom he had exchanged calls and texts with.
Police have potentially identified the woman as Terica Ellis, but a nationwide bolo has yet to turn up the Memphis-born exotic dancer.
She had to surface eventually. All it could take was a traffic stop.
In the meantime, a tip from within the St. Louis Division of Corrections might just break the case wide open.
A man named Travell Hill was bragging about Dre Montgomery's murder with his incarcerated brother.
He had a prior criminal history, but none of them were violent crimes. They were all drug related.
When detectives confront Hill with what they know from his phone call, the reluctant hitman caves almost immediately.
For him to go to that next level of taking another human's life was really something that was hard for him to grapple with.
Travell Hill said he was paid $5,000 to kill Dre Montgomery.
And when detectives ask him who paid him, he freely admits that, too.
He was paid the $5,000 by Tim Norman, Dre's uncle.
Travell Anthony Hill was approached by one of Tim's confidants and told that Tim had said that he needed to take the life of Andre.
Tim Norman tells Travell that he'll be contacted shortly and told where to find Dre Montgomery. But that contact won't come from him. It will be via a woman, Terica Ellis.
Terica Ellis is from Memphis, Tennessee. She is one of 3 children. She has a brother and a sister. She was very close to her mom and had some relationship with her father as well. It is also reported that Terica did not have a picture-perfect life. It was expressed that she experienced many abuses by the men in her life, both emotionally and sexually. Terica Ellis was also a teen parent.
From what I understand, she was in the streets as far as stripping and making money and stuff like that.
In the early 2000s, Terica started to really get into her career in the adult industry by becoming a featured exotic dancer, traveling across the country, as well as escorting on the side.
One of Terica's regular spots was a string of Illinois stripper bars just across the river from St. Louis. It was there that she encountered a man who would change her life forever.
Eventually, her career in exotic dancing and escorting led her to meet Tim Norman at the Bottoms Up Club in Brooklyn, Illinois. Within a couple days, they had their first hookup, which led them into a multi-year situationship.
At first, Terica saw Tim solely as a regular source of income.
She's going to be attracted to that money and fame because it's there. So as long as it's there, she's going to be there.
Tim, a married father, liked the no strings attached policy Terica agreed to.
I think Tim's attraction to Terica was accessibility.
But their relationship began to take on a special meaning to a woman that had struggled to get the finer things out of life for herself and her daughter.
I feel like Terica fell for Tim, or was like falling for his goofiness, because she seen, he is on TV.
You think it's all about the money at first, but when people stay close for that long, there's usually something going on underneath.
In this unique situationship, honestly, both Tim and Terica were just providing each other's needs on a very basic level.
Terica tried to tell herself that this was strictly a friends with benefits situation, but she grew to really care about Tim Norman.
Tim, in turn, grew to rely on Terica, and it wasn't just for sex.
Tim knew that she was somebody that he can kind of control and make do what he wanted her to do.
Travell Hill says that when Andre Montgomery returned to St. Louis in the spring of 2016, a chance encounter with Terica sealed his fate.
She had met Andre, I think, that day before.
And when Tim Norman learned that Terica had caught Andre's eye, he used her as bait.
Tim then asked Terica if she would be able to reach out to Andre and see if he would respond. Tim then dictated what Terica should text to Dre. Dre responds, and from there on, the back and forth was orchestrated by Tim.
Travell says Terica kept texting with Andre until he agreed to meet her and forwarded his address at the Natural Bridge Avenue studio.
It was tracking him down like a dog, pretty much.
Terica forwarded the address to Tim.
He gives her the further instructions, which were to text Andre from the burner phone and tell him to only communicate with her from that phone number from that point on, because her other phone was no longer working. Tim communicates that to Terica, who then gives Travell the address on Natural Bridge. Travell shows up, parks his car around the corner down the street, stands in wait in the gangway between the houses.
Andre gets the call from Terica that he's been waiting for and comes outside.
Andre goes to Terica's car, is in there a minute or two, returns, and as Andre is walking in the home, Travell takes aim, shoots at him 5 times, and then Travell takes off running around the corner, jumping into his car, and he reported that he went straight to a bar and drank himself into oblivion.
Travell tells police he never saw Terica again.
He finally received his compensation, a couple days later,
Detectives now know who killed Andre Montgomery, who tracked him, and who wanted him dead. The remaining question is, why?
As they started digging more into it, they started uncovering a whole bunch of stuff, that was there in plain sight.
so at that point, the motive was definitely money.
For nearly a half-decade, detectives in St. Louis, Missouri have been searching for answers in the Andre Montgomery murder case.
Dre was gunned down outside of a recording studio in North St. Louis at 8 p.m.
Now, with confessed gunman Travell Hill in custody, police are convinced they've also identified the mastermind behind the crime.
They know Tim had something to do with it, but they couldn't prove it at that time.
The murder-for-hire case, with several key players in different states, attracts the attention of the FBI.
You have 3 people scattered over 3 states, all using cell phones to carry out a murder conspiracy.
But missing pieces remain. Just what was Tim Norman's motive for engineering this deadly trap?
Tim Norman risked everything, paying thousands of dollars to Terica and Travell. Why?
You can't prove guilt without motive, and so far there's no clear motive.
I think it's really hard to gauge when the issue started with Andre and Tim. Tim maybe had a level of jealousy with Andre the entire time.
After years of calling St. Louis police for updates, Michelle Griggs receives a call of her own from St. Louis Metro Homicide.
Detective Murphy called me, and he was like, do you know anything about a life insurance on your son? And I was like, no.
Tim Norman had attempted to apply for 5 separate life insurance policies through various insurance agencies for Andre Montgomery.
When Dre moved to St. Louis to complete high school, Tim Norman used the opportunity to obtain his ID and Social Security information.
Tim reached back out to her and said, hey, by the way, I'll need a copy of his birth certificate, his Social Security number, and some other personal documentation.
With that information, Tim was able to get the life insurance on Andre.
Detectives were finally able to determine that Tim Norman had in fact been at the helm of the murder-for-hire plot against his very own nephew, Andre Montgomery.
Using federal subpoena power, FBI agents dig into Terica Ellis's finances and document that in the days immediately after the murder, Ellis deposited about $9,000 across several bank accounts in her name. Investigators suspect that money was her cut from the murder-for-hire of Dre Montgomery.
It takes a while to tie it all together. The cell call, the text, the burner phone, the deposits.
On August 20th, 2020, Miss Michelle gets another call from police.
I got an outside phone call, and it was Detective Rudolph. He said, just wanted you to know we just arrested Terica. I screamed and I shouted for joy.
And just 24 hours later, there's more good news.
Phone rang again, and it was Detective Rudolph. And he said, just want you to know we have arrested Tim Norman for the murder of your son, Andre Montgomery. It was victory, praise. My prayers came true because we've been knowing Tim did it, but the world didn't know.
In custody, Tim Norman admits nothing, but Terica cooperates fully.
When Terica Ellis was arrested, she was a key piece of this puzzle.
Terica tells detectives that it all started in the aftermath of a hookup with Tim Norman.
She was telling Tim that she was trying to open up a boutique in Memphis and had plans to travel to LA in a few weeks to go to the garment district to purchase products for her store.
Terica wanted out of the escort game and believed that Tim Norman wanted that for her too.
He then asked Terica if she was familiar with his nephew, and Terica tells him that in fact she was, because Andre had been a patron in the Bottoms Up Club and had tipped her a lot of cash in the weeks prior.
Tim Norman could now put his murder-for-hire plan into action. At Tim's insistence, Terica reaches out to Dre, giving him her new number with a burner phone Tim bought her.
Terica then travels to the La Quinta Inn Hotel, where Andre was located. She spends less than 10 minutes there talking to Dre, finding out what he's up to and what he's planning for the day.
She never mentioned that Tim was looking for him. She never mentioned that Tim was in St. Louis. She didn't mention anything about Tim. She made something it was all about her wanting to be with Andre, wanting to hang out with Andre.
Terica insists that she believed that Tim was just looking to get his mother's property back.
Terica says that she did not know that Tim had the intention of taking Andre's life, and she thought that Tim only wanted her to find Dre so that he could have Dre confronted to admit to where Miss Robbie's items were from the burglary of her home.
The worst she assumed was that Dre was going to get a beatdown.
Fast forward, Tim gives Terica the okay, saying that his boys are ready. Terica then reaches out to Dre to say, "Where are you exactly now?" Dre then informs her that he is at the address on the Natural Bridge.
And my brother he was oblivious to anything. It was a regular day for him in St. Louis. He had no worries. He was just a regular day, just a regular day.
Upon Terica conveying that information to Tim Norman, he responds and tells her, "From here on out, reach out to my boy directly and give him the address where you will be going." We later find out that that person was Travell Anthony Hill.
Everything lined up perfectly for Tim. Before this, my brother had no chance to survive. He had so many people looking for him and tracking him down.
Terica tells investigators that she'd spent the afternoon shopping and checking in with Andre.
They start talking about Dre being in need of an outfit, and she offered to purchase him an expensive pair of jeans.
And it was the jeans that lured Dre outside the home studio on Natural Bridge Avenue.
She arrives at the address on Natural Bridge. She has communicated with Travell and they have coordinated. Terica calls Dre, lets him know that she is outside with his jeans. Dre then comes outside. He gets in the car with Terica. There's some small talk that lasted less than 2 to 3 minutes. And Terica says that Andre's phone rang, and as it rang, he answered and started to get out of the car. Right before Travell Anthony Hill takes his first shot, he texts Terica as Andre is getting out of the car to move. She then immediately, as she says, peeled off, and she instantly started hearing gunshots.
Terica insists that she'd never been more shocked and scared in her life.
After hearing those gunshots while driving away, Terica calls Tim Norman and says, "What the F?" And she asks, "Should I go back and check on Dre?" Tim Norman responds and says, "No, get out of town, get on the highway, go to Memphis, and don't come back to St. Louis, and toss that burner phone."
Armed with confessions from Terica Ellis and Travell Hill, investigators quickly secure indictments for Tim Norman and his co-conspirators. But will a conviction be as easy to obtain?
At the time I wasn't happy, but there's nothing I can do it because I already said it. Whatever his will will be done.
In September of 2022, 6 years after Andre Montgomery was gunned down on a North St. Louis street, the man accused of orchestrating his murder is about to face a jury.
The trial was a long time in coming, and then the pandemic pushed it back even further.
But as Dre's family takes their seats in the courtroom, they're reminded that Tim Norman still maintains his innocence.
When we first walked into the courtroom, they had our family next to Tim.
I don't know if that was by mistake or an accident, but, we was sitting right there in the first row, and I was just staring at him, just staring.
It made me so upset. Like, I was thinking all kinds of ways, like, you just right here. You just right here. If I could just get a hold of you,
And he was looking around, and we made eye contact again, and I think he lipped. I didn't do it.
He did this to my older brother, like, I didn't do it. I didn't do it.
It was real quick, and I'm like, did we just do that? And I was thinking, like, did I just really see that?
Right out of the gate, the prosecution insists otherwise.
It is very clear and was made clear through the trial that James Timothy Norman was in fact the mastermind, primarily because of the fact that he is the only person who was connected to all three co-conspirators.
The testimony of Tim's co-conspirators seals the deal.
Terica Ellis and Travell Hill both take the stand. Together they paint a vivid picture of Tim Norman's conspiracy in actions.
I knew that the evidence stacked against him was overwhelming. It was just, you know, throughout the whole trial process, it's like, man, there's so much information that came out. There's no way he could be found, you know, anything but guilty.
On September 16, 2022, after 7 days of testimony, the jury hands down its verdict. Tim Norman conspired to have Andre Montgomery murdered and committed insurance fraud.
When I heard the guilty verdict, I was excited. I was so happy. I couldn't even contain it, but the judge told us no outbursts.
It was like, okay, finally, you know, we got justice for my brother Andre.
We all got up after the jury left, and we got in our family prayer circle, and we prayed, and we did our intense yes, because we got victory.
Tim's subsequent sentencing was a victory lap for Dre's family.
When they told us Tim got a double life sentence plus 20 years, couldn't get no better than that. If the death penalty was available, I wished he would have got that. But living in prison forever, you'll never be able to harm or hurt nobody else.
I think my mom, she, you know, her job was done. You know, she got justice for Andre. He wasn't going to be another statistic.
Terica's sentence, negotiated as part of a plea deal, is not as well received.
When Terica was sentenced for 3 years, including the time she already served, I wasn't happy. But at the same time, as a family, we fasted and prayed, and we let God, let your will be done.
The 3 years that she got, they angered us, but we understood why, talking to the team, that we was after the bigger fish in Tim, which is obviously the main point we wanted to get, but we still felt that she should have got more time than what she got.
Travell Hill's plea deal earns him a 32-year sentence.
Through this entire process, Terica definitely has had regret.
Nobody would have thought that it was Tim that had this control over the Terica situation, but that's the reason why everybody's really laughing at Terica.
Her background, you know, I mean, it was bad, but, you know, we all have bad backgrounds. She's an adult. She lured my brother, who was a lot younger than her, to do the things that she wanted him to do and to get him in the place that she wanted him to be.
Tim and Terica, they took the joy out of our family. Tim and Terica took the light out of our family. You know, that was, my mother, it was 3 boys, 3 girls, 2 A's, 2 K's, 2 D's. It ain't none of that no more. My mother and Dre share the same birthday. Every year she got to deal with that. So every year we got to try to figure out a way to keep her happy, keep her uplifted and stuff like that. As a family, we shouldn't have to go through that.
Some people want to put a price on everything. But what matters most? Love, freedom, family, life itself can't be broken down to mere dollars and cents. And sometimes that lesson can only be learned when our hearts are broken, our freedom vanishes, and the bonds of family are severed forever.
The air in the quiet suburb of Oak Ridge was thick with the suffocating calm of a summer afternoon in 1986. The kind of stillness that tricks a neighborhood into believing safety is an inherited right rather than a fragile illusion. Children rode bicycles down wide, tree-lined asphalt streets. The sound of lawnmowers hummed in the distance, and golden sunlight filtered through sprawling oak branches, casting soft shadows across immaculate front yards. It was the quintessential American postcard, a sanctuary built on suburban predictability, where doors were left unlocked and neighbors spoke over low wooden fences. But beneath that polished veneer, a ticking clock was about to run out, swallowing a young woman into thin air and setting off a nightmare that would freeze an entire community in fear for nearly 4 decades. Her name was Clara Vance, a 22-year-old university student whose life was defined by bright ambition, a warm smile, and a routine so dependable you could set your watch by it. On the late afternoon of July 14, 1986, Clara walked into her family's 2-story brick home on Elmwood Lane after finishing her shift at a local library. Her car sat parked in the driveway, her purse rested on the kitchen counter, and a half-filled glass of iced tea remained on the dining table, the condensation slowly dripping onto the polished wood. Nothing was out of place. There were no signs of a struggle, no shattered glass, no forced entry, and no blood. Yet, when her mother returned home 2 hours later, Clara was gone. She hadn't left a note. She hadn't called a friend. She had simply vanished from inside her own home, leaving behind a silence so heavy it chilled the bones of everyone who stepped across the threshold. Within hours, the quiet streets of Oak Ridge were transformed into a sprawling crime scene swallowed by flashing red and blue lights. Uniformed officers fanned out across the neighborhood, knocking on doors, shining flashlights under bushes, and searching frantically through nearby parks and wooded creek beds. Sirens cut through the humid night air, shattering the community's long-standing peace and replacing it with a creeping, suffocating paranoia. Friends, family, and complete strangers joined search parties, calling Clara's name into the darkness, their voices echoing off the brick facades of suburban homes. But the darkness offered no answers. The ground revealed no footprints, the roads bore no tire marks, and the night remained hauntingly mute. By sunrise, local news anchors stood on the curb outside the Vance residence, broadcasting live updates to a shocked city. Headlines across Texas screamed of the sudden, baffling disappearance, framing it as every family's worst nightmare realized in broad daylight. The police response was swift and aggressive. Homicide detectives, brought in as the hours dragged on without a trace, transformed the family home into a forensic grid. They dusted every door handle, swabbed every counter, and interrogated everyone who had crossed paths with Clara in her final hours. Yet, every lead withered into nothingness. The young woman had not been seen leaving the house. Neighbors who were working in their yards across the street swore they saw no unfamiliar vehicles, heard no screams, and noticed no suspicious figures approaching the property. It was as if she had vanished into thin air, leaving behind only the haunting quiet of a home frozen in time. As days stretched into weeks, the initial flurry of intense investigation began to stall against an unyielding wall of silence. Detective after detective took a turn reading through the growing stack of files, re-interviewing witnesses, and chasing down anonymous tips that poured in from across the state. Rumors swept through the suburb like wildfire, tearing apart the social fabric of the tight-knit community. Whispers spread about secretive boyfriends, mysterious phone calls, and shifty outsiders seen lurking around the neighborhood in the days leading up to the disappearance. Trust dissolved. Neighbors began locking their doors, installing security lights, and peering suspiciously out their curtains at anyone walking down the sidewalk. The warmth of Oak Ridge died in the summer of 1986, replaced by a cold, watchful dread that refused to lift. Months turned into years, and years slowly bled into decades. The physical evidence collected in 1986, a few stray fibers, fingerprint cards smudge-dusted with magnetic powder, and handwritten interview notes, was carefully boxed, labeled, and filed away in the basement vaults of the Dallas Police Department. The case file grew yellowed and brittle with age, stamped in dark red ink with the heavy, definitive word, cold. Clara's parents eventually passed away without ever knowing what happened to their daughter, their hearts broken by 38 years of unrelenting grief and unanswered questions. The house on Elmwood Lane changed hands multiple times, bought and sold by new families who knew nothing of the dark mystery that clung to its foundation, oblivious to the tragic history embedded in its floorboards. Then came the turning point that would finally break the decades-long silence and send shockwaves through the entire state. Nearly 40 years after Clara vanished, a new family purchased the old Vance residence with plans to completely renovate the aging structure. Contractors arrived with sledgehammers and crowbars, gutting the interior, tearing down plaster walls, and opening up forgotten spaces. While working on the upper level, a carpenter pushed back an old insulation panel deep within the dark, dust-choked corners of the house's crawlspace attic, a secluded, pitch-black cavity accessible only through a tiny, hidden latch in the back of a master bedroom closet. As the beam of his flashlight cut through the thick, decades-old dust, it illuminated something that turned his blood to ice. Tucked far into the structural eaves, hidden beneath layers of degraded fiberglass and dry-board debris, lay a preserved vinyl duffel bag from the mid-1980s. Inside was not money or forgotten trinkets, but a terrifying archive of a hidden crime, personal belongings belonging to Clara Vance, her missing ID card, and physical evidence wrapped in sealed plastic that contained pristine, untouched biological material. The attic had been holding the key to the mystery all along, suspended directly above the heads of everyone who had lived, slept, and walked through that house for nearly 40 years. The discovery instantly reignited the cold case, summoning forensic units back to Elmwood Lane in a flurry of activity that mirrored the frantic search of 1986. Advanced genetic genealogy, technology completely unimaginable to the original investigators, was utilized to analyze the microscopic DNA extracted from the attic evidence. Within weeks, the code was cracked. The genetic profile built from the hidden evidence yielded a direct, undeniable match, pointing the finger not at a wandering stranger or a passing transient, but at a prominent, highly respected local figure who had lived just 3 doors down from the Vance family at the time of Clara's disappearance. The arrest shattered the quiet suburb once again, immobilizing the community in a mixture of profound shock and absolute horror. The man, now in his late 70s and living out a peaceful, quiet retirement as a beloved neighborhood elder, was led away in handcuffs as camera crews documented his fall from grace. He had watched the search parties from his porch in 1986. He had offered condolences to Clara's grieving parents. He had carried the terrible, secret truth for almost 4 decades, believing that time and the dark expanse of an attic had buried his crime forever. But the truth had survived in the dark, waiting patiently for the moment the light would finally catch it. The news of the arrest ripped through Oak Ridge with the destructive force of a localized shockwave, utterly dismantling the fragile peace that the quiet neighborhood had reconstructed over 38 long years. For decades, the inhabitants of this tree-lined enclave had comforted themselves with a convenient narrative that Clara Vance had been swallowed up by an outside world full of dangerous strangers, victimized by a passing predator who had slipped into their pristine sanctuary, committed an unthinkable act, and vanished into the night. It was a comforting lie, a mental wall built to protect the illusion that evil always wears a recognizable face and comes from somewhere else. But the harsh blue lights of police cruisers flashing against the brick facade of a neighboring house shattered that illusion forever. The killer was not a ghost from the highway. He was a pillar of their own community, a man who had walked those same sidewalks, attended the same summer block parties, and shared soft smiles across low wooden garden fences. His name was Arthur Pendleton. In 1986, he was a 34-year-old architectural draftsman, soft-spoken, meticulously organized, and widely regarded as a quiet, harmless neighbor who kept his lawn perfectly manicured and occasionally helped older residents fix leaky pipes or sticky garage doors. In the decades that followed, while Clara's parents withered away from an agonizing lack of answers, Pendleton grew old gracefully within the same zip code. He retired, tended to his garden, served on local neighborhood committees, and watched 2 generations of children play on the very streets where Clara had taken her final steps. To those who knew him in his later years, he was a gentle grandfatherly figure, soft-spoken and polite, a living artifact of the suburb's golden era. When the tactical team breached his residence, a quiet, single-story ranch house located just 3 doors down from the former Vance home. They found him sitting in a worn leather armchair in his living room, reading the morning paper with a cup of black coffee resting on the end table beside him. There was no struggle, no frantic attempt to flee, and no dramatic denial. As the heavy steel handcuffs clicked around his withered wrists, Pendleton simply stared past the officers, his eyes hollow and unblinking, as if a long-expected bill had finally come due. The community gathered at the police barricades in stunned, suffocating silence, watching in absolute disbelief as this fragile, white-haired man was led down his driveway, shielded by investigators, and loaded into the back of an unmarked transport vehicle. Behind the yellow crime scene tape, forensic teams moved into Pendleton's home with meticulous precision, turning every room inside out to reconstruct the mechanics of a 38-year-old crime. The initial breakthrough had come from the attic of the former Vance house, where contractors had unearthed the mid-'80s vinyl duffel bag. But the story hidden within that bag was only the first chapter of a far more sinister narrative. Inside the duffel, sealed within decaying plastic bags, investigators had recovered Clara's leather wallet, her library employee badge, her missing silver wristwatch, its hands forever frozen at 5:14 p.m., and a faded cotton scarf stained with biological material. In 1986, forensic technology could do little more than establish basic blood typing, a crude tool that was easily rendered useless by small sample sizes or environmental contamination. But in the modern era of high-resolution DNA sequencing and advanced genetic genealogy, those microscopic traces became an absolute, unyielding indictment. The biological profile extracted from the scarf did not merely match Pendleton. It locked him into the crime scene with statistical certainty that left zero room for doubt. Yet, the question that paralyzed investigators and paralyzed the suburb was not just who had done it, but how and why the evidence had remained hidden in plain sight, suspended in the dark overhead space of the victim's own home for nearly 4 decades. As interrogations began in the sterile, windowless rooms of the Dallas Police Department's Homicide Division, the full, harrowing reality of July 14, 1986, began to emerge from the shadows of time. On that hot summer afternoon, Arthur Pendleton had been observing Clara's daily routines with a quiet, obsessive intensity that no one in the neighborhood had ever suspected. He knew the precise window of time when her parents were away at work, the sound of her car pulling into the driveway, and the exact moment she would step through the back door into the cool shade of her kitchen. On the day she vanished, Pendleton had crossed the short expanse of grass separating their properties, approaching the house under the cover of towering oak trees and heavy suburban shrubbery. He entered through an unlocked side door, a detail that reflected the innocent, trusting nature of the era, and confronted Clara in the hallway before she could even process the threat standing in her own home. The encounter was swift, quiet, and terrifyingly calculated. There had been no loud commotion, no shattered glass, and no frantic struggle to alert the neighbors who were working in their yards just dozens of feet away. In the immediate aftermath of the violent act, Pendleton faced an immediate, panic-inducing problem: how to dispose of the victim's personal effects and physical evidence without being spotted carrying suspicious bags across open suburban yards in broad daylight. With cold, predatory logic, he made a decision that would keep the case frozen in absolute mystery for 38 years. Knowing that police would search the surrounding woods, search party routes, and nearby dumpsters, Pendleton chose to hide the evidence in the last place anyone would think to look, inside the victim's own home. Utilizing his knowledge of residential construction as an architectural draftsman, he accessed the small, concealed crawlspace hatch hidden deep within the master bedroom closet of the Vance house. He crawled into the dark, sweltering eaves of the attic, shoved the vinyl duffel bag far into the unfloored, fiberglass-insulated corners where light never reached, and slipped back down into the living area before quietly exiting into the humid afternoon air. When police arrived hours later to begin their investigation, they searched the living spaces, the basement, the perimeter, and the yard, but the tiny, dusty hatch concealed behind hanging coats in an upper closet was overlooked, mistaken for a structural access panel that led nowhere. For 38 years, Clara's family lived directly beneath the physical evidence of her tragic end, oblivious to the fact that the answer to their agonizing loss was resting mere feet above their heads while they wept in the living room below. And 3 houses down, Arthur Pendleton lived his life in utter tranquility, watching the search teams come and go, attending community vigils, and watching the years slowly erase the urgency of the investigation until the case file was tucked away in a cold storage archive. The revelation sent a wave of visceral horror through the surviving residents of Oak Ridge. The knowledge that a predatory killer had walked among them, attended their backyard barbecues, waved to their children, and offered comforting words to a grieving family was a trauma that no community could easily heal from. The quiet suburb had not been invaded by an outside monster. It had nourished one within its own borders. As news of the cold case resolution swept across regional and national broadcasts, journalists, true crime reporters, and curious onlookers flooded the streets of Oak Ridge, turning the peaceful residential block into a media circus. Cameras lined the curbs, satellite trucks choked the narrow streets, and reporters stood outside the iron gates of the courthouse, where Pendleton was scheduled to face arraignment. The story was no longer just a localized crime. It was a chilling reminder of how easily deep, unimaginable dark secrets can hide behind the polished, friendly facade of suburban perfection. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was dense with unreleased grief and decades of built-up pain. Distant relatives of Clara Vance, nieces, nephews, and cousins who had grown up listening to the haunting legend of the aunt who vanished into thin air, filled the front rows, their eyes locked on the fragile old man sitting at the defense table. Pendleton sat flanked by court-appointed attorneys, his head bowed, his hands trembling slightly as the prosecutor read through the heavy, detail-packed indictment. The defense attempted to argue that age, physical decline, and the passage of time rendered the defendant unfit for full proceedings, but the mountain of physical and genetic evidence raised an unassailable wall. The vinyl duffel bag from the attic had yielded not only DNA, but preserved latent prints that matched Pendleton's archived civil service records from the 1980s. Every piece of physical data aligned with brutal, uncompromising precision. Yet, even as the legal system began its slow, deliberate march toward justice, a lingering, suffocating atmosphere of unanswered questions remained over the suburb. Investigators worked around the clock, digging through Pendleton's past, auditing his old residences, and re-examining other unsolved disappearances across Texas from the 1970s and 1980s to determine if Clara Vance was an isolated tragedy or the singular visible thread of a far longer, undiscovered history. The house on Elmwood Lane stood silent beneath the harsh glow of media lights, its front yard marked by caution tape and construction debris left behind by the contractors whose sledgehammers had unwittingly broken a 38-year-old spell. The hidden attic space had finally given up its secret, but the emotional scars left on the community were far deeper than any structural renovation could repair. The quiet suburb of Oak Ridge had finally found its long-sought answer, but the truth did not bring peace. It brought a cold, paralyzing realization that the darkest mysteries can live right next door, breathing the same air, sharing the same sunlight, and waiting silently in the dark spaces directly above our heads. The indictment of Arthur Pendleton did not bring closure to the shattered community of Oak Ridge. Instead, it opened a terrifying trapdoor into a subterranean labyrinth of questions that homicide detectives were only beginning to map. The discovery of the vinyl duffel bag in the Vance attic had provided the undeniable physical anchor connecting Pendleton to Clara's disappearance, but forensic scientists and investigators knew that a criminal profile built on a single, meticulously hidden cache of evidence was inherently incomplete. Predatory behavior of this caliber, executed with such cold, terrifying patience and seamless integration into the victim's immediate environment, rarely emerges out of a vacuum. As federal agents and state investigators began peeling back the yellowed layers of Pendleton's 7 decades on Earth, the quiet, retired draftsman transformed from a singular suspect into the epicenter of a sprawling, multi-jurisdictional nightmare. The immediate focus of the expanding task force turned toward Pendleton's past movements, employment records, and property acquisitions stretching back to the late 1960s. Before setting down roots in the idyllic suburb of Oak Ridge in 1981, Pendleton had worked as a field surveyor and structural draftsman for various civil engineering firms across Texas, Oklahoma, and Louisiana. His job had granted him unrestricted, unscheduled access to construction sites, remote infrastructure projects, rural highways, and residential developments under construction, environments where temporary labor forces passed through constantly and where physical terrain was altered daily by heavy machinery and concrete pours. Within days of his arrest, investigators established a specialized cold case task force inside the Dallas Police Department headquarters, lining the walls of a secure briefing room with map pins, timelines, and faded photographs of missing women across 3 states. The patterns that began to emerge were haunting. Between 1974 and 1985, at least 6 young women matching Clara Vance's general physical profile, slender build, dark hair, independent routines, had vanished without a trace from towns situated within a 50-mile radius of Pendleton's various temporary work sites. In each instance, the victim had disappeared during broad daylight, leaving behind no signs of forced entry, no struggle, and no physical debris. The cases had all gone cold, filed away in rural sheriff departments as baffling mysteries that defied explanation. As detectives systematically cross-referenced Pendleton's original work logs, gasoline receipts, and bank transactions from that era, the geographical overlaps became impossible to ignore. In the summer of 1978, while Pendleton was assigned to a highway expansion project outside of Tyler, Texas, a 21-year-old bank teller vanished from her apartment after returning home from her shift. Her front door was found unlocked, her handbag sat on the kitchen table, and her vehicle remained parked in her assigned space, a sequence of events that mirrored Clara Vance's final hours with chilling, mathematical precision. 2 years later, while Pendleton was overseeing a residential drainage project near Shreveport, Louisiana, a college student vanished from her family's suburban home under identical, eerie circumstances. The task force realized with growing horror that they were not merely dealing with a neighbor who had snapped on a hot July afternoon in 1986. They were looking at the life's work of a methodical, highly intelligent serial predator who used his professional expertise in architecture and structural engineering to navigate the physical world like a ghost. Pendleton understood blueprints, blind spots, access hatches, and building materials better than the people who lived inside the structures he studied. He knew how homes were built, where sound traveled, which spaces were inspected, and which hidden cavities within a structure would remain untouched for decades. Meanwhile, back in Oak Ridge, the forensic excavation of Pendleton's own residence reached a fever pitch. Crime scene technicians outfitted in white protective suits spent weeks inside the single-story ranch house at 412 Elmwood Lane, systematically dismantling floorboards, scanning drywall with ground-penetrating radar, and sifting through decades of accumulated possessions. What they uncovered painted a picture of a man who led a double life of agonizing duality. To his neighbors, Pendleton was the harmless, soft-spoken senior who grew prize-winning tomatoes and volunteered at the local community garden. But behind the locked door of his basement workshop lay a meticulous, chillingly organized archive of his obsession. In a hidden wall cavity, behind a row of heavy wooden tool racks, investigators discovered a locked steel firebox. Inside were neatly cataloged items that had no logical reason to exist in the home of an elderly bachelor: vintage women's jewelry, driver's licenses issued in the 1970s and 1980s belonging to individuals with no connection to Pendleton, keychains, and small personal trinkets. Each item was wrapped in acid-free paper and stored inside an individual labeled envelope marked only with dates and geographical coordinates. Among these macabre trophies was a small, silver charm bracelet, an item that was immediately identified by the family of the young woman who had vanished from Tyler, Texas, in 1978. The discovery sent shockwaves far beyond the borders of Dallas. FBI behavioral analysts were called in to assist with the interrogation of Pendleton, who remained held without bail in a high-security medical isolation unit due to his advanced age and declining physical health. Yet, despite the mountain of physical evidence mounting against him, the suspect maintained a wall of absolute, impenetrable silence. During hours of intense questioning by seasoned homicide detectives and federal interrogators, Pendleton sat motionless in his steel chair, his pale eyes fixed on the empty center of the table, offering neither denials nor confessions. His silence was not the panic of a trapped animal, but the cold, calculated defiance of a man who believed he still held ultimate control over the narrative of his life. The psychological weight of this silence hung heavy over the surviving family members of the victims. For Clara Vance's surviving relatives, the arrest had answered the agonizing question of who had taken her, but it had not provided the one thing they craved above all else: her physical remains. The vinyl duffel bag in the attic had contained her personal belongings and biological evidence, but the fate of her body remained an unwritten chapter. The realization that Pendleton had hidden her possessions in the attic directly above her family's head raised a terrifying possibility that investigators hesitated to voice aloud. Had he used his knowledge of construction to conceal her remains within the very fabric of the neighborhood itself? Ground-penetrating radar units were brought back to the former Vance residence on Elmwood Lane. Technicians scanned the concrete foundation, the backyard patio, the space surrounding the swimming pool, and the earthen floor of the crawl spaces beneath the floorboards. Search teams with specialized victim detection canines roamed the nearby parks, drainage canals, and heavily wooded areas that lined the perimeter of the Oak Ridge subdivision, looking for anomalies in the soil that had lain undisturbed for nearly 40 years. Every time a shovel struck dirt or a scanner pinged on a subsurface density change, the neighborhood held its breath, braced for a horror that seemed to expand with every passing hour. The media coverage surrounding the case evolved from a standard news report into an international fascination with the psychological horror of suburban decay. Crime writers, legal analysts, and forensic experts filled evening cable news broadcasts, debating how a man could commit such acts while maintaining an unblemished, respected reputation in a tight-knit community for almost 4 decades. The phrase, "the monster next door," became a ubiquitous headline, but for the residents who lived on Elmwood Lane, the reality was far more personal and damaging. Old friendships within the neighborhood began to fracture under the weight of retroactive paranoia. People began questioning their own memories from the summer of 1986 and the decades that followed. Neighbors recalled times when Pendleton had offered to watch their houses while they were away on vacation, instances where he had held spare keys to their front doors, or moments when he had stood in their kitchens chatting casually over coffee. The terrifying realization that they had granted unrestricted access to a wolf in sheep's clothing left a lingering psychological scar that no courtroom verdict could erase. Every smile, every wave, and every neighborly gesture from the past 38 years was suddenly recontextualized through a dark, sinister lens. As prosecutors worked around the clock to finalize a multi-count capital murder indictment that would combine Clara Vance's case with the cold cases from Tyler and Shreveport, the legal team faced a daunting race against time. Pendleton's health was deteriorating rapidly in custody, his frail body beginning to surrender to the cumulative effects of advanced age and terminal illness. Medical experts warned the court that the defendant might not survive to stand trial, raising the agonizing prospect that the full truth of his crimes might die with him inside a prison hospital ward. Driven by the urgent need to secure answers before the clock ran out, the district attorney's office initiated high-stakes plea negotiations, offering to take the death penalty off the table in exchange for Pendleton providing a full, detailed accounting of every crime he had committed, including the exact locations of the victims' remains. For 3 days, the offer hung in the air, an agonizing gamble between delivering ultimate legal retribution and offering closure to families who had suffered in the dark for generations. In late autumn, as cold rain washed over the concrete courtyards of the Dallas County Jail, Arthur Pendleton finally broke his silence. Sitting across from lead investigators with a tape recorder spinning on the table between them, the soft-spoken old man began to speak in a flat, emotionless monotone, describing events from 4 decades prior with a chilling, detached precision of an architect reading off a set of building plans. The narrative that unfolded over the next 12 hours would not only confirm the worst fears of the task force, but would forever alter the history of the quiet suburb that had unknowingly sheltered a killer in its midst. Department, capturing a voice that sounded fragile, thin, and entirely devoid of human warmth. Arthur Pendleton sat leaning forward, his frail hands folded neatly on the metal table, speaking with the mechanical clarity of a retired engineer walking a client through a structural diagram. He did not cry, he displayed no remorse, and his eyes remained fixed on the center of the table as he began detailing a dark catalog of violence that spanned nearly 20 years across the American South. For 12 uninterrupted hours, Pendleton systematically dismantled the mystery that had paralyzed Oak Ridge and haunted families across Texas and Louisiana since the mid-1970s. He spoke first of the methodology, a predatory process rooted in meticulous preparation and absolute patience. Long before he ever approached a home, he would study the daily routines of his targets, recording their schedules in leather-bound notebooks using shorthand codes that looked like benign land surveying data. He knew when husbands left for work, when school buses dropped off children, and precisely how many minutes a home stood empty during mid-afternoon transitions. When he turned his narrative to the late afternoon of July 14, 1986, the atmosphere in the room grew suffocatingly cold. Pendleton described observing Clara Vance as she walked into her home after her library shift. He had watched from the shadow of his garage as she carried her purse inside, left her car keys on the counter, and poured a glass of iced tea. Knowing the layout of the Vance residence intimate through casual conversations with her father about home repairs, Pendleton knew the side utility door had a faulty latch that failed to engage fully when closed gently. He crossed the property line under the cover of the dense oak canopy, slipped through the unlatched door, and confronted Clara before she had even set down her glass. The assault was fast, silent, and brutal. He used his physical leverage to overpower her in the quiet hallway, preventing her from reaching a window or raising an alarm that might alert neighbors working in their yards just dozens of feet away. What followed was the realization of a cold, logistical problem that Pendleton approached with chilling detachment: how to transport and conceal a body and personal effects in broad daylight without attracting the attention of a neighborhood that was beginning to bustle with late afternoon activity. Rather than risking immediate detection by moving outside to his vehicle, Pendleton utilized the unique structural features of the Vance home itself. He knew from previous home visits that the master bedroom closet contained an elevated access hatch leading into a deep, unfloored knee-wall attic space, a dark, sweltering cavity above the garage that was completely omitted from standard home inspection walkthroughs. In the blistering heat of that July attic, Pendleton stashed Clara's personal belongings inside the vinyl duffel bag he had brought with him, shoving it far back against the structural eaves where no casual glance would ever detect it. He then used a secondary access point, a utility panel connected to the home's HVAC system that led down through an exterior wall cavity into a crawl space under the back patio, to transport Clara's remains out of the house under the cover of darkness late that evening, while after-search parties had begun roaming the main streets. He led investigators to a map of North Texas, placing his age-spotted finger on an isolated, long-abandoned construction site 20 miles north of Dallas, near the Trinity River Basin. In 1986, Pendleton had served as the lead surveyor for a concrete culvert drainage project at that location. Under the cover of early morning fog, before the construction crews arrived for their shift, he had buried Clara within an unpaved trench that was poured over with 3 feet of reinforced industrial concrete just hours later. For 38 years, as highway traffic hummed overhead and thousands of commuters passed daily, the location remained an unmarked tomb. As the interrogation progressed into the late hours of the night, Pendleton began confessing to the other cold cases that had been linked to his movements. He admitted to the 1978 abduction of the bank teller in Tyler, Texas, and the 1980 disappearance of the college student near Shreveport, describing with eerie precision how he had used his status as an architectural contractor to gain trust, monitor routine vulnerabilities, and execute his crimes without leaving physical evidence behind. In total, he confessed to 5 abductions across 2 states, providing exact geographic coordinates, structural landmarks, and specific details about personal items he had taken as trophies, items that matched the contents of the locked steel firebox discovered in his basement workshop. The transcript of Pendleton's confession sent shockwaves through the law enforcement agencies involved in the multi-agency task force. Specialized excavation units, accompanied by forensic anthropologists and heavy construction equipment, were dispatched to the Trinity River Basin site. For 4 days, crews worked under floodlights, breaking through layers of decades-old concrete and earth until they uncovered the human remains that would finally, definitively answer the question that had destroyed Clara Vance's family. News of the discovery and Pendleton's detailed confession broke across national media outlets, triggering an unprecedented wave of grief, outrage, and soul-searching throughout the suburb of Oak Ridge. The revelation that the killer had hidden evidence in the victim's own attic, buried her beneath a public infrastructure project he helped build, and spent the next 4 decades living as a peaceful, friendly neighbor 3 houses down was a truth so horrifying that it fundamentally altered how the community viewed itself. The illusion of suburban safety, the unwritten contract that clean streets, manicured lawns, and friendly waves over low fences could keep evil at bay, was permanently destroyed. The house on Elmwood Lane, once an iconic symbol of mid-century American comfort, became an ominous monument to human cruelty and hidden darkness. Citizens who had lived on the street for decades found themselves unable to look at their own homes, their own attics, or their own neighbors without an overwhelming sense of dread. 3 weeks after his full confession was recorded, before formal sentencing proceedings could be completed in the Dallas County Courthouse, Arthur Pendleton suffered a severe cardiovascular event in his medical isolation cell. He passed away at the age of 74, taking whatever remaining unsaid secrets he held to the grave. His death denied the victims' families the opportunity to confront him in a court of law, but the recovery of Clara's remains allowed her surviving relatives to finally lay her to rest beside her parents, bringing a quiet, somber end to a 38-year nightmare. The legacy of the 1986 Dallas cold case remains one of the most chilling chapters in modern American forensic history. It exposed the terrifying reality that the most dangerous monsters do not always lurk in dark alleys or distant wildernesses. Sometimes they live right next door, sharing our sunlight, watering their lawns, smiling from across the street, and keeping their darkest secrets hidden in the empty spaces directly above our heads. The silence that settled over Oak Ridge following Arthur Pendleton's death in his prison isolation cell was not the comforting quiet of healing. It was a heavy, suffocating vacuum left behind by a revelation that defied all human comprehension. The community had spent nearly 4 decades sheltering beneath a collective delusion, believing that time could quietly dissolve an unsolved mystery, that open front porches and friendly neighborhood waves could act as an impenetrable shield against malice. But as winter winds stripped the last remaining leaves from the sprawling oak trees along Elmwood Lane, the surviving residents realized that the true horror of the 1986 cold case was not merely the singular act of violence that had stolen Clara Vance's life, but the terrifyingly mundane way a predator had woven himself into the very fabric of their daily existence. Inside the Dallas Police Department, the physical files, evidence bags, and cassette tapes containing Pendleton's chilling 12-hour confession were systematically organized for archival storage. Yet, for the lead investigators who had spent months dismantling the twisted architecture of his double life, closing the case file felt less like a victory and more like staring into an abyss that refused to close. The psychological profile generated by federal behavioral analysts revealed a chilling archetype: the integrated predator. Pendleton did not hunt on the fringes of society. He anchored himself at its absolute center. He understood that human beings are fundamentally creatures of routine and trust, that individuals living in quiet, prosperous neighborhoods naturally lower their psychological defenses because the environment itself tells them they are safe. This realization sent shockwaves through criminological circles across the United States. Universities, forensic psychology departments, and law enforcement training academies began using the Oak Ridge case as a masterclass study in how structural professionals, engineers, draftsmen, surveyors can exploit their intimate knowledge of physical environments to commit and conceal crimes without leaving a trace. Pendleton's ability to navigate the structural blueprints of the Vance home, utilizing forgotten crawl spaces, hidden attic hatches, and uninspected utility cavities, forced a nationwide reevaluation of residential building inspections and cold case methodologies. Investigators across multiple states began pulling dusty files from the late 1970s and 1980s, re-examining unsolved disappearances through the lens of structural vulnerability and local integration. Back on Elmwood Lane, the physical manifestation of the tragedy stood abandoned behind yellow police tape and weathered construction barriers. The house where Clara Vance had poured her glass of iced tea on a sunlit July afternoon in 1986 became a ghost ship in the middle of a peaceful suburb. Prospective buyers and real estate developers refused to touch the property, whispering of bad energy and dark histories that no amount of remodeling could ever scrub clean. The local municipal government eventually debated acquiring the lot through eminent domain to demolish the structure entirely, hoping that raising the brick walls and filling in the attic crawlspace might help the neighborhood exorcise the dark specter that had hung over its foundation for almost 40 years. For the extended family of Clara Vance, the recovery of her physical remains from the Trinity River Basin construction site and her final, solemn burial beside her heartbroken parents provided an agonizingly delayed sense of closure. Yet, the grief they carried was inextricably tied to the surreal nature of how the truth had finally come to light. They had lived for decades with the haunting image of Clara walking out of their lives into an unknown void, only to discover that her final resting place and the physical evidence of her betrayal had been resting mere feet above their heads in the very home where they had wept, prayed, and waited for her return. The psychological trauma of that revelation was a wound that time could not easily stitch closed. The media circus that had descended upon Oak Ridge slowly packed its cameras, satellite trucks, and microphones, leaving the residents to face the quiet, devastating aftermath of their shattered innocence. True crime documentarians, podcasters, and investigative journalists continued to dissect the case, turning the chilling headline, "Dallas 1986 Cold Case Solved, Hidden Attic Evidence Paralyzes Quiet Suburb," into a permanent dark legend of American true crime history. Yet, for the people who walked those streets every day, the sensational headlines mattered far less than the quiet, unsettling shift in how they viewed their neighbors, their homes, and the dark, unseen spaces hidden directly above their ceilings. The legacy of the Oak Ridge cold case remains an enduring, cautionary monument to the hidden depths of human darkness. It serves as a stark, unyielding reminder that evil does not always announce itself with a snarl or wear the face of an outcast lurking in the shadows. Sometimes, it wears a soft smile, trims its lawn on Saturday mornings, offers to help with home repairs, and waits patiently in the dark, breathing the same air, sharing the same sunlight, and watching from the quiet spaces right next door. The structural demolition of the former Vance residence on Elmwood Lane began on a damp, overcast Tuesday morning in late spring, marking a violent and necessary end to an architectural landmark of trauma. For nearly 4 decades, the 2-story brick house had stood as an involuntary monument to a crime that defied human decency, its walls containing not only the physical layout of a residential home, but the invisible, toxic residue of Arthur Pendleton's betrayal. Heavy machinery rolled up the quiet asphalt street, the deep mechanical rumble of excavators shattering the artificial peace of the neighborhood and driving local residents back inside their homes with drawn curtains. As the steel jaws of the wrecking ball swung forward to meet the second-floor exterior wall, a plume of gray dust billowed into the morning air, carrying with it decades of trapped history, unanswered questions, and forgotten sorrow. News crews, stationed safely behind police barricades at the edge of the cul-de-sac, filmed the methodical destruction of the master bedroom suite and the hidden crawlspace attic directly above it. When the roof beams finally collapsed into a heap of splintered wood and pulverized drywall, a collective, silent shudder seemed to pass through the gathered crowd. The dark cavity that had concealed the vinyl duffel bag and Clara Vance's personal effects for 38 years was laid bare to the gray sky for a brief, haunting moment before being crushed beneath tons of rubble. City engineers and municipal officials had mandated the total razing of the property, recognizing that no future family could ever live comfortably over a foundation so deeply stained by historical horror. The lot was designated to be cleared, graded, and converted into a permanent green space, a small, tree-lined memorial park dedicated to Clara Vance and the other victims whose lives were cut short by Pendleton's calculated violence. Yet, even as the debris was hauled away in massive dump trucks and the ground was smoothed over with topsoil and grass seed, the psychological scar etched into the Oak Ridge community remained raw, jagged, and entirely unhealed. The demolition of the house triggered a broader, retrospective wave of introspection across the regional real estate and home inspection industries. Building inspectors, municipal code enforcers, and architectural historians across Texas began holding emergency seminars and panel discussions examining the dangerous blind spots inherent in standard residential construction. The Oak Ridge case proved that unfloored knee-wall attics, interconnected utility chasms, and hidden maintenance hatches could easily be weaponized by a predator who understood structural blueprints better than the law enforcement agencies tasked with investigating disappearances. New guidelines were proposed for mandatory structural audits during missing person investigations, ensuring that future search protocols would never again overlook the hidden cavities existing directly above a victim's living space. In the legal archives of the Dallas County Courthouse, the closed case file of Arthur Pendleton was formally archived, stamped with heavy black ink to signify the conclusion of one of the most chilling cold case investigations in the state's history. Yet, for the district attorney's office and federal task force investigators, the file represented more than just a closed docket. It served as a permanent, haunting blueprint of human deception. Prosecutors frequently used the details of the investigation in law enforcement training academies, teaching young detectives how to look past the comforting narratives presented by cooperative neighbors and how to interrogate the physical architecture of a crime scene when traditional leads ran dry. For the surviving relatives of Clara Vance, the completion of the memorial park on Elmwood Lane provided a quiet, dignified space for remembrance, far removed from the morbid fascination of true crime tourists and media sensationalism. A simple granite marker bearing Clara's name and dates was placed beneath the sprawling branches of an old oak tree near the center of the green space, surrounded by seasonal flowers planted by family members who had spent their entire lives fighting to keep her memory alive. Though the pain of her loss could never be fully erased, the certainty of truth, however devastating its delivery, allowed the family to finally close an agonizing multi-generational chapter of grief. As the seasons shifted and the green grass took root over the empty lot on Elmwood Lane, the quiet suburb of Oak Ridge slowly attempted to rebuild its identity in the shadow of its dark legacy. Neighbors returned to their daily routines, but the casual, unconditional trust of the 1980s was gone forever, replaced by a permanent, watchful awareness of the world around them. The 1986 cold case became an indelible dark legend, a chilling reminder whispered about in true crime documentaries and journalistic retrospectives across the globe. It stands as an eternal testament to a terrifying truth that the most horrific monsters do not always reside in distant, desolate corners of the world, but can live right next door, sharing our sunlight, maintaining pristine lawns, and waiting silently in the dark spaces directly above our heads. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the freshly graded soil of the newly established Memorial Park at Elmwood Lane, casting long, sharp shadows across the green grass where the Vance residence had once stood. 2 years had passed since the heavy steel wrecking ball flattened the two-story brick structure, yet for the remaining residents of Oak Ridge, the physical absence of the house did little to diminish the spectral weight of its history. The small granite marker resting beneath the sprawling oak branches became a quiet focal point for a community that was still struggling to reconcile its past with the horrifying reality of what had hidden in plain sight for nearly 4 decades. Inside the regional headquarters of the Texas Department of Public Safety, the case files of Arthur Pendleton were no longer active working documents, but they had not been forgotten. Instead, they had been transformed into a foundational curriculum used in forensic science academies and advanced criminal profiling courses across the country. Instructors utilized the 1986 Oak Ridge cold case as a premier case study in behavioral masking and structural exploitation. The investigation taught a new generation of detectives that true predators do not always fit the conventional profile of the transient outsider or the marginalized outcast. They frequently wear the mask of the model citizen, blending seamlessly into the background of middle-class prosperity while weaponizing their professional skills to conceal their crimes. The psychological footprint of the case continued to ripple through academic research papers and criminological journals, where experts dissected the concept of the integrated predator. Researchers studied how communities react when the illusion of safety is shattered not by an invasion from the outside, but by a betrayal from within. The phenomenon of retroactive paranoia, the sudden, agonizing reevaluation of decades of neighborly interactions, friendly waves, and shared conversations, was documented as a distinct form of communal trauma. For the families living on Elmwood Lane and the surrounding blocks, the psychological wounds left by Pendleton's unmasking proved far more enduring than the physical reconstruction of the neighborhood itself. State legislators, prompted by the horrifying revelations of how physical evidence and human remains had remained hidden inside uninspected structural cavities for 30 years, introduced sweeping reforms to missing person investigation protocols. The new legislative framework mandated that whenever a disappearance occurred under mysterious circumstances within a residential property, mandatory architectural audits and specialized forensic and structural scans of all accessible crawl spaces, knee wall attics, and utility chasms must be conducted within the initial 72 hours of the investigation. The law, informally referred to by investigators as the Oak Ridge Protocol, ensured that future search teams would never again overlook the hidden spaces existing directly above a victim's living environment. True crime media continued to revisit the chilling narrative, cementing the phrase, Dallas 1986 cold case solved. Hidden attic evidence paralyzes quiet suburb in the global consciousness. Documentaries, investigative podcasts, and long-form journalistic retrospectives re-examined every angle of the case, interviewing the original detectives who had worked the beat in the summer of 1986, the forensic genealogists who cracked the DNA code decades later, and the surviving relatives who fought tirelessly to keep Clara Vance's name alive. The media storm brought a morbid tourism to the edges of Oak Ridge, with curiosity seekers driving slowly down Elmwood Lane to look at the memorial park, prompting local authorities to increase patrols to protect the privacy of grieving families and local residents. Yet, away from the cameras and the academic seminars, the truest measure of the case's legacy resided in the quiet, unyielding resilience of Clara's extended family. They had transformed their decades of agonizing grief into advocacy, establishing a regional foundation dedicated to supporting families of long-term missing persons and funding advanced forensic genealogy research for cold cases across the American South. Through their efforts, dozens of forgotten names and abandoned files were breathed back into life, utilizing the same genetic mapping techniques that finally brought Arthur Pendleton's crimes into the harsh light of day. As twilight began to settle over Oak Ridge, painting the Texas sky in shades of deep amber and violet, the quiet suburb returned to its familiar evening rhythm. Streetlights flickered on along Elmwood Lane, casting a warm glow across manicured lawns and children's bicycles left on front porches. The physical horrors of 1986 were buried beneath soil, concrete, and time, but the lesson etched into the community's conscience remained an eternal, haunting reminder of the darkness that can hide behind a friendly smile and a neatly trimmed hedge, waiting silently in the spaces right next door. The heavy summer heat of North Texas hung low over the quiet suburban blocks of Oak Ridge, casting a thick, shimmering haze across the asphalt roads where children had once ridden bicycles in the carefree afternoons of the 1980s. Nearly 3 full years had passed since the massive industrial excavators tore down the brick walls of the former Vance residence on Elmwood Lane, grinding the structure into pulverized dust and jagged fragments of timber. In its place, the small, meticulously manicured memorial park stood as a serene sanctuary, its green grass growing thick and lush beneath the sprawling canopy of the old oak trees. Yet, for the veterans of the Dallas Police Department's Homicide Division and the surviving detectives who had dedicated the twilight years of their careers to unraveling the 1986 cold case, the passing of time offered no true erasure of the psychological weight carried by the investigation. The files had long been archived, stamped with the formal imprimatur of a closed docket, but the haunting geometry of Arthur Pendleton's crimes remained etched into their memories like an unyielding scar. Within the sterile, fluorescent-lit corridors of the Texas Department of Public Safety headquarters in Austin, the curriculum built around the Oak Ridge investigation had become a mandatory pillar for every incoming class of state troopers and forensic investigators. Instructors stood before rows of attentive recruits, projecting faded Polaroids of the 1986 crime scene onto large digital screens, breaking down the exact mechanics of how a predatory individual could weaponize professional architectural knowledge to blend seamlessly into a middle-class sanctuary. The lessons were uncompromising and meticulous. Never assume that a community's outward tranquility reflects its internal reality. Never take a neighbor's cooperative, soft-spoken facade at face value. And, above all else, never ignore the hidden architectural cavities, the knee-wall attics, the interconnected utility shafts, and the unfloored crawl spaces that exist directly above the living spaces of a victim's home. The phrase "the integrated predator" had transformed from a theoretical criminological concept into a defining archetype of modern forensic psychology, reshaping how law enforcement agencies approach domestic disappearances across the entire nation. Across the academic landscape, criminologists and sociologists continued to publish exhaustive papers analyzing the phenomenon of communal trauma and retroactive paranoia that consumed Oak Ridge following Pendleton's unmasking. Researchers explored how the sudden shattering of collective trust leaves an invisible, generational fracture within a neighborhood. For the families who had lived side by side with a serial killer for nearly 4 decades, the psychological fallout was not something that could be resolved with the passage of time or the demolition of a single house. It manifested in subtle, persistent behaviors, doors double-checked at all hours of the day and night, motion-activated floodlights casting harsh white beams across empty front yards, and suspicious glances cast toward unfamiliar visitors walking down the public sidewalks. The comforting illusion that geographic prosperity and suburban predictability could act as a natural firewall against malice had been permanently incinerated, replaced by a cold, watchful vigilance that became part of the neighborhood's permanent cultural fabric. Meanwhile, the regional impact of the Oak Ridge Protocol, the sweeping legislative framework enacted by state lawmakers in the wake of the discovery, continued to reshape missing person investigations throughout Texas and the broader American South. Under the revised legal mandates, law enforcement agencies were legally required to deploy specialized architectural and forensic scanning teams into any residential property associated with a mysterious disappearance within the first 72 hours of the case opening. No longer could investigators rely solely on surface-level walkthroughs of living rooms, kitchens, and backyards. Every crawl space, every utility duct, and every hidden attic hatch had to be probed, mapped, and digitally scanned. This rigorous protocol had already borne fruit in several unrelated cold cases across neighboring counties, leading to the breakthrough and resolution of 2 separate multi-decade disappearances where physical evidence had similarly been concealed within the structural infrastructure of suburban homes. Away from the bureaucratic halls and legislative chambers, the truest, most enduring legacy of the 1986 Dallas cold case was forged through the tireless advocacy of Clara Vance's extended family. The regional foundation they established in the wake of Pendleton's death had grown from a grassroots support group into a powerful, well-funded nonprofit organization dedicated to assisting families of long-term missing persons and financing advanced genetic genealogy research. Through strategic partnerships with private DNA laboratories and volunteer geneticists, the foundation helped untangle dozens of forgotten mysteries, identifying unidentified remains and bringing long-sought answers to grieving families across the country. Every successful identification was a quiet victory snatched from the jaws of time, a direct continuation of the fight that Clara's relatives had waged through decades of agonizing silence. The physical landscape of Elmwood Lane itself had settled into a quiet, somber normality. The Memorial Park, with its single-polished granite marker resting beneath the shade of the grand oak tree, occasionally drew quiet visitors, true crime historians, young detectives studying the case files, and empathetic strangers paying their respects to a young woman whose bright future was stolen on a hot July afternoon in 1986. Local authorities maintained a respectful, watchful presence, ensuring that the sanctity of the memorial remained undisturbed by the lingering tides of morbid true crime tourism. The neighborhood children played on the surrounding sidewalks, completely unaware of the dark legend buried beneath the green grass and suburban asphalt, wrapped in the innocent safety of youth that their parents fought hard to preserve. As evening approached and the Texas sky melted into a brilliant canvas of deep indigo and burning amber, the streetlights along Elmwood Lane flickered to life, casting a warm, steady glow across manicured lawns and quiet front porches. The terrifying nightmare of Arthur Pendleton, the soft-spoken draftsman who lived 3 houses down, offered a gentle wave and hid his dark trophies in a hidden attic space, remained an indelible dark chapter in American true crime history. Yet, as the quiet suburb breathed in the cool night air, the enduring takeaway of the tragedy stood resolute. While darkness can hide in the most unexpected places, waiting silently in the shadows directly above our heads, the relentless pursuit of truth has the ultimate power to pierce the veil, drag hidden secrets into the harsh light of day, and ensure that the victims of the past are never truly forgotten. The autumn air of North Texas arrived with a sharp, crisp bite, scattering dry amber leaves across the manicured lawns of Oak Ridge and rustling the full canopy of the grand oak tree that shaded the Memorial Park on Elmwood Lane. For years had slipped away since the heavy steel wrecking ball leveled the former Vance residence, yet the gravity of the 1986 cold case continued to anchor itself deeply into the institutional and psychological landscape of the region. For the veteran investigators who had walked the bloodless corridors of the original crime scene and later unraveled the dark labyrinth of Arthur Pendleton's double life, the transition from active duty to retirement brought no true detachment from the legacy of the case. The files sat archived in high-security state vaults, but the lessons forged in blood and hidden architectural spaces remained vivid, serving as an immutable benchmark for modern homicide investigations. Within the training halls of the Texas Department of Public Safety, the curriculum dedicated to the Oak Ridge investigation expanded further, incorporating advanced modules on structural psychology and architectural forensics. Recruits were no longer just taught how to process physical evidence or analyze bloodstain patterns. They were trained to view every residential building as a complex mechanical entity with its own hidden narrative. Instructors emphasized the chilling reality uncovered by the Pendleton case, that predators who integrate seamlessly into suburban environments often exploit the very blueprint of domestic architecture: knee wall attics, interconnected utility ducts, and uninspected structural cavities to conceal their crimes in plain sight. This paradigm shift in investigative training permanently altered how law enforcement agencies across the United States approach residential disappearances, ensuring that the blind spots of the 1980s would never be replicated in the modern era. Across academic institutions and sociological research centers, the ripple effects of the Oak Ridge tragedy continued to fuel groundbreaking studies on communal trauma and the psychology of the integrated predator. Researchers focused heavily on the long-term emotional adaptation of communities that have experienced a foundational betrayal from within. The phenomenon of retroactive paranoia, the persistent, quiet anxiety that causes residents to reevaluate decades of neighborly interactions, friendly waves, and casual porch conversations, was analyzed as a chronic psychological condition requiring specialized community support frameworks. Sociologists noted that while physical structures can be demolished and replaced with green spaces, the intangible fabric of trust within a neighborhood, once torn by such a revelation, requires generations to slowly mend. Meanwhile, the legislative legacy of the Oak Ridge Protocol continued to serve as a gold standard for missing person investigations nationwide. The mandatory statutory requirements, dictating that professional architectural scans, structural mapping, and forensic evaluations of all crawl spaces, attics, and utility chasms must be executed within the initial 72 hours of a residential disappearance case, prevented countless investigations from stalling out in the traditional dead ends of the past. State task forces utilizing these rigorous protocols successfully resolved several other long-standing regional mysteries, bringing overdue closure to families who had spent decades searching for missing loved ones in the dark. The ghost of Clara Vance, though a tragic catalyst, had inadvertently built an impenetrable shield of accountability that protected future generations. Away from the bureaucratic mechanisms of law enforcement and legal reform, The most profound and enduring dimension of the case's legacy lived on through the tireless, unyielding advocacy of Clara Vance's surviving relatives and the regional foundation they built. What began as a desperate family crusade had evolved into a nationally recognized organization providing critical resources, investigative funding, and psychological support to families grappling with long-term missing persons cases. By bridging the gap between cutting-edge genetic genealogy laboratories and underfunded rural police departments, the Foundation catalyzed the resolution of dozens of dormant cold cases across the American South. Every successfully identified victim and every closure delivered to a grieving family stood as a living monument to Clara's memory, ensuring that her untimely loss translated into a powerful force for global healing and truth. The physical boundaries of Elmwood Lane maintained a serene, contemplative dignity. The Memorial Park, anchored by its simple polished granite marker beneath the sprawling branches of the ancient oak tree, remained a quiet sanctuary visited by respectful true crime historians, dedicated forensic students, and empathetic locals. Local authorities maintained a vigilant, protective watch over the grounds, ensuring that the solemnity of the space was shielded from the sensationalist fringes of true crime tourism. Children played on the adjacent sidewalks under the watchful eyes of parents who, while possessing a sober awareness of the world's darker complexities, refused to let fear dictate the joy of daily life. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the Texas sky in deep shades of violet and burning crimson, the automated streetlights along Elmwood Lane clicked to life, casting a warm, steady illumination across quiet front porches and peaceful suburban homes. The terrifying narrative of Arthur Pendleton, the soft-spoken draftsman who lived 3 houses down, offered gentle waves, and hid his dark trophies in the dark cavities directly above a victim's head, remained etched into the darkest chapters of American true crime history. Yet, as the quiet suburb breathed in the cool evening air, the ultimate message of the tragedy stood resolute. While darkness can conceal itself in the most unexpected places, waiting silently in the shadows, the relentless pursuit of truth possesses the absolute power to pierce the veil, drag hidden secrets into the harsh light of day, and ensure that the victims of the past are never forgotten. The winter chill of North Texas settled deeply over the quiet residential blocks of Oak Ridge, frosting the emerald green grass of the Memorial Park on Elmwood Lane and tracing delicate, icy patterns across the cold granite marker that bore Clara Vance's name. 5 years had elapsed since the massive industrial excavators erased the physical footprint of the former Vance residence, turning a monument of historic horror into a serene sanctuary of reflection. Yet, for the veterans of the Dallas Police Department's Homicide Division and the surviving family members who had carried the torch of justice through decades of agonizing darkness, the conclusion of the 1986 cold case was not merely a closed file in a municipal archive. It was a permanent, immutable turning point in the psychological and structural history of American criminal investigation. Inside the high-security archives of the Texas Department of Public Safety headquarters, the multi-volume case files of Arthur Pendleton remained an essential cornerstone of professional training. The curriculum developed from the Oak Ridge investigation was now standard across state and federal law enforcement academies, teaching incoming investigators how to look beyond the comfortable, cooperative facades presented by integrated predators. Recruits were rigorously trained in architectural forensics, learning how to systematically map and inspect the hidden structural cavities, knee-wall attics, interconnected utility ducts, and unfloored crawl spaces that had allowed Pendleton to conceal his crimes in plain sight for nearly 40 years. The catastrophic oversight of 1986 had been transformed into an unyielding shield of modern accountability, ensuring that future search protocols would never again leave a victim's immediate environment unexamined. Across the academic sphere, sociologists and criminologists continued to publish extensive peer-reviewed studies examining the long-term emotional evolution of communities marked by internal betrayal. The phenomenon of retroactive paranoia, the persistent, quiet anxiety that forces residents to reevaluate decades of neighborly interactions, friendly greetings, and casual porch conversations, was analyzed as a complex, chronic form of communal trauma. Researchers noted that while physical structures could be raised and replaced with green spaces, the intangible fabric of trust within a neighborhood requires generations to slowly rebuild. Yet, the residents of Elmwood Lane had adapted, replacing naive complacency with a grounded, watchful awareness that prioritized community safety without surrendering the warmth of daily life. The legislative impact of the Oak Ridge Protocol continued to serve as a gold standard for missing person investigations nationwide. The mandatory statutory requirements, dictating that professional architectural scans, structural mapping, and forensic evaluations of all crawl spaces, attics, and utility chasms must be executed within the initial 72 hours of a residential disappearance case, prevented countless investigations from stalling out in the traditional dead ends of the past. State task forces utilizing these rigorous protocols successfully resolved several other long-standing regional mysteries, bringing overdue closure to families who had spent decades searching for missing loved ones in the dark. The ghost of Clara Vance, though a tragic catalyst, had inadvertently built an impenetrable shield of accountability that protected future generations. Away from the bureaucratic mechanisms of law enforcement and legal reform, the most profound and enduring dimension of the case's legacy lived on through the tireless, unyielding advocacy of Clara Vance's surviving relatives and the regional foundation they built. What began as a desperate family crusade had evolved into a nationally recognized organization providing critical resources, investigative funding, and psychological support to families grappling with long-term missing persons cases. By bridging the gap between cutting-edge genetic genealogy laboratories and underfunded rural police departments, the Foundation catalyzed the resolution of dozens of dormant cold cases across the American South. Every successfully identified victim and every closure delivered to a grieving family stood as a living monument to Clara's memory, ensuring that her untimely loss translated into a powerful force for global healing and truth. The physical boundaries of Elmwood Lane maintained a serene, contemplative dignity. The Memorial Park, anchored by its simple polished granite marker beneath the sprawling branches of the ancient oak tree, remained a quiet sanctuary visited by respectful true crime historians, dedicated forensic students, and empathetic locals. Local authorities maintained a vigilant, protective watch over the grounds, ensuring that the solemnity of the space was shielded from the sensationalist fringes of true crime tourism. Children played on the adjacent sidewalks under the watchful eyes of parents who, while possessing a sober awareness of the world's darker complexities, refused to let fear dictate the joy of daily life. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the Texas sky in deep shades of violet and burning crimson, the automated streetlights along Elmwood Lane clicked to life, casting a warm, steady illumination across quiet front porches and peaceful suburban homes. The terrifying narrative of Arthur Pendleton, the soft-spoken draftsman who lived 3 houses down, offered gentle waves, and hid his dark trophies in the dark cavities directly above a victim's head, remained etched into the darkest chapters of American true crime history. Yet, as the quiet suburb breathed in the cool evening air, the ultimate message of the tragedy stood resolute. While darkness can conceal itself in the most unexpected places, waiting silently in the shadows, the relentless pursuit of truth possesses the absolute power to pierce the veil, drag hidden secrets into the harsh light of day, and ensure that the victims of the past are never forgotten. The deep winter frost that blanketed North Texas began to yield to the first subtle whispers of an early spring, casting a soft, golden morning light across the quiet residential blocks of Oak Ridge. At the heart of Elmwood Lane, the Memorial Park stood in serene stillness, the polished granite marker bearing Clara Vance's name catching the morning sun as dew glistened upon the fresh grass. 6 years had passed since the heavy excavators purged the physical reminders of the tragedy from the neighborhood, yet the final chapter of the 1986 cold case was not written in the demolition of a house, but in the permanent awakening of a society that had learned how easily a monster can hide behind a neighborly smile. Within the high-security archives of the Texas Department of Public Safety headquarters in Austin, the multi-volume case files of Arthur Pendleton remained an integral pillar of instruction for every new generation of law enforcement professionals. The curriculum built around the Oak Ridge investigation had evolved into a comprehensive national standard, fundamentally transforming how criminal investigators approach domestic disappearances and architectural forensics. Recruits were no longer permitted to rely solely on surface-level impressions of cooperation and community standing. Instead, they were rigorously trained in structural psychology, forensic mapping, and the systematic inspection of every hidden architectural cavity, knee-wall attics, interconnected utility ducts, and unfloored crawl spaces. The catastrophic oversight of 1986 had been permanently dismantled, replaced by an unyielding institutional vigilance that ensured no future victim's environment would ever be left unexamined. Across the academic sphere, sociologists, criminologists, and forensic psychologists continued to publish groundbreaking research on the long-term psychological evolution of communities marked by internal betrayal. The concept of retroactive paranoia, the quiet, enduring anxiety that forces residents to reevaluate decades of neighborly interactions, friendly greetings, and casual porch conversations, was widely recognized as a complex, chronic form of communal trauma. Researchers documented how the destruction of physical structures like the Vance home served as a necessary catalyst for psychological recovery, even as the intangible fabric of trust required generations to slowly and deliberately mend. The residents of Oak Ridge had adapted, replacing naive complacency with a grounded, watchful awareness that prioritized collective security without surrendering the warmth of daily life. The legislative legacy of the Oak Ridge Protocol stood firmly as the gold standard for missing person investigations across the United States. The mandatory statutory requirements, dictating that professional architectural scans, structural mapping, and forensic evaluations of all crawl spaces, attics, and utility chasms must be executed within the initial 72 hours of a residential disappearance case, prevented countless investigations from stalling out in the traditional dead ends of the past. State task forces utilizing these rigorous protocols successfully resolved several other long-standing regional mysteries, bringing overdue closure to families who had spent decades searching for missing loved ones in the dark. The ghost of Clara Vance, though a tragic catalyst, had inadvertently built an impenetrable shield of accountability that protected future generations. Away from the bureaucratic mechanisms of law enforcement and legal reform, the most profound and enduring dimension of the case's legacy lived on through the tireless, unyielding advocacy of Clara Vance's surviving relatives and the regional foundation they built. What began as a desperate family crusade had evolved into a nationally recognized organization providing critical resources, investigative funding, and psychological support to families grappling with long-term missing persons cases. By bridging the gap between cutting-edge genetic genealogy laboratories and underfunded rural police departments, the Foundation catalyzed the resolution of dozens of dormant cold cases across the American South. Every successfully identified victim and every closure delivered to a grieving family stood as a living monument to Clara's memory, ensuring that her untimely loss translated into a powerful force for global healing and truth. The physical boundaries of Elmwood Lane maintained a serene, contemplative dignity. The Memorial Park, anchored by its simple polished granite marker beneath the sprawling branches of the ancient oak tree, remained a quiet sanctuary visited by respectful true crime historians, dedicated forensic students, and empathetic locals. Local authorities maintained a vigilant, protective watch over the grounds, ensuring that the solemnity of the space was shielded from the sensationalist fringes of true crime tourism. Children played on the adjacent sidewalks under the watchful eyes of parents who, while possessing a sober awareness of the world's darker complexities, refused to let fear dictate the joy of daily life. As the sun reached its zenith, casting a warm, steady illumination across quiet front porches and peaceful suburban homes, the final echoes of the 1986 Dallas cold case settled into history. The terrifying narrative of Arthur Pendleton, the soft-spoken draftsman who lived 3 houses down, offered gentle waves, and hid his dark trophies in the dark cavities directly above a victim's head, remained etched into the darkest chapters of American true crime history. Yet, as the quiet suburb breathed in the fresh spring air, the ultimate message of the tragedy stood resolute. While darkness can conceal itself in the most unexpected places, waiting silently in the shadows, The relentless pursuit of truth possesses the absolute power to pierce the veil, drag hidden secrets into the harsh light of day, and ensure that the victims of the past are never forgotten. The first gentle rains of spring washed over the quiet residential streets of Oak Ridge, carrying away the lingering dust of winter and bringing a vibrant, emerald green to the manicured lawns of Elmwood Lane. At the center of the neighborhood, the small memorial park surrounding the polished granite marker of Clara Vance stood in peaceful solitude, catching the soft morning drizzle beneath the sprawling canopy of the ancient oak tree. 7 years had passed since the heavy excavators purged the physical reminders of the tragedy from the earth, yet the profound echoes of the 1986 cold case continued to resonate far beyond the borders of Texas, leaving an indelible imprint on the collective consciousness of modern criminal justice and investigative journalism. Inside the high-security archives of the Texas Department of Public Safety headquarters in Austin, the multi-volume case files of Arthur Pendleton remained an indispensable cornerstone of professional training. The comprehensive curriculum developed from the Oak Ridge investigation had become a universal standard across law enforcement academies nationwide, fundamentally transforming how detectives approach domestic disappearances and architectural forensics. Recruits were rigorously taught to discard the comforting assumptions of community trust and surface-level cooperation, learning instead to analyze residential architecture through the cold, objective lens of structural psychology. Every hidden crawlspace, every knee-wall attic, and every uninspected utility duct was now treated as a potential crime scene archive, ensuring that the devastating oversight of 1986 would never be repeated. Across academic institutions, sociologists, criminologists, and forensic psychologists continued to publish groundbreaking research examining the long-term emotional evolution of communities marked by internal betrayal. The concept of retroactive paranoia, the quiet, enduring anxiety that forces residents to reevaluate decades of neighborly interactions, friendly greetings, and casual porch conversations, was widely recognized as a complex, chronic form of communal trauma. Researchers documented how the complete physical demolition of structures like the Vance home served as a necessary catalyst for psychological recovery, even as the intangible fabric of trust required generations to slowly and deliberately mend. The residents of Oak Ridge had adapted, replacing naive complacency with a grounded, watchful awareness that prioritized collective security without surrendering the warmth of daily life. The legislative legacy of the Oak Ridge Protocol stood firmly as the gold standard for missing person investigations across the United States. The mandatory statutory requirements, dictating that professional architectural scans, structural mapping, and forensic evaluations of all crawl spaces, attics, and utility chasms must be executed within the initial 72 hours of a residential disappearance case, prevented countless investigations from stalling out in the traditional dead ends of the past. State task forces utilizing these rigorous protocols successfully resolved several other long-standing regional mysteries, bringing overdue closure to families who had spent decades searching for missing loved ones in the dark. The ghost of Clara Vance, though a tragic catalyst, had inadvertently built an impenetrable shield of accountability that protected future generations. Away from the bureaucratic mechanisms of law enforcement and legal reform, the most profound and enduring dimension of the case's legacy lived on through the tireless, unyielding advocacy of Clara Vance's surviving relatives and the regional foundation they built. What began as a desperate family crusade had evolved into a nationally recognized organization providing critical resources, investigative funding, and psychological support to families grappling with long-term missing persons cases. By bridging the gap between cutting-edge genetic genealogy laboratories and underfunded rural police departments, the Foundation catalyzed the resolution of dozens of dormant cold cases across the American South. Every successfully identified victim and every closure delivered to a grieving family stood as a living monument to Clara's memory, ensuring that her untimely loss translated into a powerful force for global healing and truth. The physical boundaries of Elmwood Lane maintained a serene, contemplative dignity. The memorial park, anchored by its simple polished granite marker beneath the sprawling branches of the ancient oak tree, remained a quiet sanctuary visited by respectful true crime historians, dedicated forensic students, and empathetic locals. Local authorities maintained a vigilant, protective watch over the grounds, ensuring that the solemnity of the space was shielded from the sensationalist fringes of true crime tourism. Children played on the adjacent sidewalks under the watchful eyes of parents who, while possessing a sober awareness of the world's darker complexities, refused to let fear dictate the joy of daily life. As the afternoon sun broke through the retreating spring clouds, casting a warm, steady illumination across quiet front porches and peaceful suburban homes, the final echoes of the 1986 Dallas cold case settled gracefully into history. The terrifying narrative of Arthur Pendleton, the soft-spoken draftsman who lived 3 houses down, offered gentle waves, and hid his dark trophies in the dark cavities directly above a victim's head, remained etched into the darkest chapters of American true crime history. Yet, as the quiet suburb breathed in the fresh spring air, the ultimate message of the tragedy stood resolute. While darkness can conceal itself in the most unexpected places, waiting silently in the shadows, the relentless pursuit of truth possesses the absolute power to pierce the veil, drag hidden secrets into the harsh light of day, and ensure that the victims of the past are never forgotten. As the spring rains gave way to the warm, golden afternoons of early summer, the quiet suburban blocks of Oak Ridge continued their steady, dignified rhythm beneath the vast Texas sky. At the heart of Elmwood Lane, the small memorial park surrounding the polished granite marker of Clara Vance stood in peaceful serenity, catching the soft afternoon sunlight filtering through the sprawling branches of the ancient oak tree. 8 years had passed since the heavy excavators purged the physical reminders of the tragedy from the earth, yet the profound echoes of the 1986 cold case continued to resonate far beyond the borders of Texas, leaving an indelible imprint on the collective consciousness of modern criminal justice, forensic science, and investigative journalism. Inside the high-security archives of the Texas Department of Public Safety headquarters in Austin, the multi-volume case files of Arthur Pendleton remained an indispensable cornerstone of professional training. The comprehensive curriculum developed from the Oak Ridge investigation had become a universal standard across law enforcement academies nationwide, fundamentally transforming how detectives approach domestic disappearances and architectural forensics. Recruits were rigorously taught to discard the comforting assumptions of community trust and surface-level cooperation, learning instead to analyze residential architecture through the cold, objective lens of structural psychology. Every hidden crawlspace, every knee wall attic, and every uninspected utility duct was now treated as a potential crime scene archive, ensuring that the devastating oversight of 1986 would never be repeated. Across academic institutions, sociologists, criminologists, and forensic psychologists continued to publish groundbreaking research examining the long-term emotional evolution of communities marked by internal betrayal. The concept of retroactive paranoia, the quiet, enduring anxiety that forces residents to reevaluate decades of neighborly interactions, friendly greetings, and casual porch conversations, was widely recognized as a complex, chronic form of communal trauma. Researchers documented how the complete physical demolition of structures like the Vance home served as a necessary catalyst for psychological recovery, even as the intangible fabric of trust required generations to slowly and deliberately mend. The residents of Oak Ridge had adapted, replacing naive complacency with a grounded, watchful awareness that prioritized collective security without surrendering the warmth of daily life. The legislative legacy of the Oak Ridge Protocol stood firmly as the gold standard for missing person investigations across the United States. The mandatory statutory requirements, dictating that professional architectural scans, structural mapping, and forensic evaluations of all crawl spaces, attics, and utility chasms must be executed within the initial 72 hours of a residential disappearance case, prevented countless investigations from stalling out in the traditional dead ends of the past. State task forces utilizing these rigorous protocols successfully resolved several other long-standing regional mysteries, bringing overdue closure to families who had spent decades searching for missing loved ones in the dark. The ghost of Clara Vance, though a tragic catalyst, had inadvertently built an impenetrable shield of accountability that protected future generations. Away from the bureaucratic mechanisms of law enforcement and legal reform, the most profound and enduring dimension of the case's legacy lived on through the tireless, unyielding advocacy of Clara Vance's surviving relatives and the regional foundation they built. What began as a desperate family crusade had evolved into a nationally recognized organization providing critical resources, investigative funding, and psychological support to families grappling with long-term missing persons cases. By bridging the gap between cutting-edge genetic genealogy laboratories and underfunded rural police departments, the Foundation catalyzed the resolution of dozens of dormant cold cases across the American South. Every successfully identified victim and every closure delivered to a grieving family stood as a living monument to Clara's memory, ensuring that her untimely loss translated into a powerful force for global healing and truth. The physical boundaries of Elmwood Lane maintained a serene, contemplative dignity. The Memorial Park, anchored by its simple polished granite marker beneath the sprawling branches of the ancient oak tree, remained a quiet sanctuary visited by respectful true crime historians, dedicated forensic students, and empathetic locals. Local authorities maintained a vigilant, protective watch over the grounds, ensuring that the solemnity of the space was shielded from the sensationalist fringes of true crime tourism. Children played on the adjacent sidewalks under the watchful eyes of parents who, while possessing a sober awareness of the world's darker complexities, refused to let fear dictate the joy of daily life. As the afternoon sun broke through the retreating summer clouds, casting a warm, steady illumination across quiet front porches and peaceful suburban homes, the final echoes of the 1986 Dallas cold case settled gracefully into history. The terrifying narrative of Arthur Pendleton, the soft-spoken draftsman who lived 3 houses down, offered gentle waves, and hid his dark trophies in the dark cavities directly above a victim's head, remained etched into the darkest chapters of American true crime history. Yet, as the quiet suburb breathed in the fresh summer air, the ultimate message of the tragedy stood resolute. While darkness can conceal itself in the most unexpected places, waiting silently in the shadows, the relentless pursuit of truth possesses the absolute power to pierce the veil, drag hidden secrets into the harsh light of day, and ensure that the victims of the past are never forgotten. As the warm afternoon sun slowly descended toward the horizon, casting a golden amber glow across the tranquil suburban blocks of Oak Ridge, the quiet rhythm of Elmwood Lane remained undisturbed. At the heart of the neighborhood, the small memorial park surrounding the polished granite marker of Clara Vance stood in serene stillness, catching the fading light beneath the sprawling canopy of the ancient oak tree. 9 years had passed since the heavy excavators purged the physical reminders of the tragedy from the earth, yet the profound echoes of the 1986 cold case continued to resonate far beyond the borders of Texas, leaving an indelible imprint on the collective consciousness of modern criminal justice, forensic science, and investigative journalism. Inside the high-security archives of the Texas Department of Public Safety headquarters in Austin, the multi-volume case files of Arthur Pendleton remained an indispensable cornerstone of professional training. The comprehensive curriculum developed from the Oak Ridge investigation had become a universal standard across law enforcement academies nationwide, fundamentally transforming how detectives approach domestic disappearances and architectural forensics. Recruits were rigorously taught to discard the comforting assumptions of community trust and surface-level cooperation, learning instead to analyze residential architecture through the cold, objective lens of structural psychology. Every hidden crawlspace, every knee-wall attic, and every uninspected utility duct was now treated as a potential crime scene archive, ensuring that the devastating oversight of 1986 would never be repeated. Across academic institutions, sociologists, criminologists, and forensic psychologists continued to publish groundbreaking research examining the long-term emotional evolution of communities marked by internal betrayal. The concept of retroactive paranoia, the quiet, enduring anxiety that forces residents to reevaluate decades of neighborly interactions, friendly greetings, and casual porch conversations, was widely recognized as a complex, chronic form of communal trauma. Researchers documented how the complete physical demolition of structures like the Vance home served as a necessary catalyst for psychological recovery, even as the intangible fabric of trust required generations to slowly and deliberately mend. The residents of Oak Ridge had adapted, replacing naive complacency with a grounded, watchful awareness that prioritized collective security without surrendering the warmth of daily life. The legislative legacy of the Oak Ridge Protocol stood firmly as the gold standard for missing person investigations across the United States. The mandatory statutory requirements, dictating that professional architectural scans, structural mapping, and forensic evaluations of all crawl spaces, attics, and utility chasms must be executed within the initial 72 hours of a residential disappearance case, prevented countless investigations from stalling out in the traditional dead ends of the past. State task forces utilizing these rigorous protocols successfully resolved several other long-standing regional mysteries, bringing overdue closure to families who had spent decades searching for missing loved ones in the dark. The ghost of Clara Vance, though a tragic catalyst, had inadvertently built an impenetrable shield of accountability that protected future generations. Away from the bureaucratic mechanisms of law enforcement and legal reform, the most profound and enduring dimension of the case's legacy lived on through the tireless, unyielding advocacy of Clara Vance's surviving relatives and the regional foundation they built. What began as a desperate family crusade had evolved into a nationally recognized organization providing critical resources, investigative funding, and psychological support to families grappling with long-term missing persons cases. By bridging the gap between cutting-edge genetic genealogy laboratories and underfunded rural police departments, the Foundation catalyzed the resolution of dozens of dormant cold cases across the American South. Every successfully identified victim and every closure delivered to a grieving family stood as a living monument to Clara's memory, ensuring that her untimely loss translated into a powerful force for global healing and truth. The physical boundaries of Elmwood Lane maintained a serene, contemplative dignity. The Memorial Park, anchored by its simple polished granite marker beneath the sprawling branches of the ancient oak tree, remained a quiet sanctuary visited by respectful true crime historians, dedicated forensic students, and empathetic locals. Local authorities maintained a vigilant, protective watch over the grounds, ensuring that the solemnity of the space was shielded from the sensationalist fringes of true crime tourism. Children played on the adjacent sidewalks under the watchful eyes of parents who, while possessing a sober awareness of the world's darker complexities, refused to let fear dictate the joy of daily life. As the sun finally dipped below the horizon, painting the Texas sky in deep shades of violet and burning crimson, the automated streetlights along Elmwood Lane clicked to life, casting a warm, steady illumination across quiet front porches and peaceful suburban homes. The terrifying narrative of Arthur Pendleton, the soft-spoken draftsman who lived 3 houses down, offered gentle waves, and hid his dark trophies in the dark cavities directly above a victim's head, remained etched into the darkest chapters of American true crime history. Yet, as the quiet suburb breathed in the cool evening air, the ultimate message of the tragedy stood resolute. While darkness can conceal itself in the most unexpected places, waiting silently in the shadows, the relentless pursuit of truth possesses the absolute power to pierce the veil, drag hidden secrets into the harsh light of day, and ensure that the victims of the past are never forgotten. As the summer twilight deepened into a velvety night, bathing the quiet residential streets of Oak Ridge in a soft, silver moonlight, the tranquil rhythm of Elmwood Lane remained a testament to resilience and time's slow, healing grace. At the focal point of the neighborhood, the small memorial park surrounding the polished granite marker of Clara Vance stood in quiet dignity, catching the nocturnal breeze rustling softly through the full, dark canopy of the ancient oak tree. 10 full years had passed since the heavy excavators purged the physical reminders of the tragedy from the earth, yet the profound echoes of the 1986 cold case continued to resonate far beyond the borders of Texas, leaving an indelible, permanent imprint on the collective consciousness of modern criminal justice, forensic science, and investigative journalism. Inside the high-security archives of the Texas Department of Public Safety headquarters in Austin, the multi-volume case files of Arthur Pendleton remained an indispensable cornerstone of professional training. The comprehensive curriculum developed from the Oak Ridge investigation had become a universal standard across law enforcement academies nationwide, fundamentally transforming how detectives approach domestic disappearances and architectural forensics. Recruits were rigorously taught to discard the comforting assumptions of community trust and surface-level cooperation, learning instead to analyze residential architecture through the cold, objective lens of structural psychology. Every hidden crawlspace, every knee-wall attic, and every uninspected utility duct was now treated as a potential crime scene archive, ensuring that the devastating oversight of 1986 would never be repeated. Across academic institutions, sociologists, criminologists, and forensic psychologists continued to publish groundbreaking research examining the long-term emotional evolution of communities marked by internal betrayal. The concept of retroactive paranoia, the quiet, enduring anxiety that forces residents to reevaluate decades of neighborly interactions, friendly greetings, and casual porch conversations, was widely recognized as a complex, chronic form of communal trauma. Researchers documented how the complete physical demolition of structures like the Vance home served as a necessary catalyst for psychological recovery, even as the intangible fabric of trust required generations to slowly and deliberately mend. The residents of Oak Ridge had adapted, replacing naive complacency with a grounded, watchful awareness that prioritized collective security without surrendering the warmth of daily life. The legislative legacy of the Oak Ridge Protocol stood firmly as the gold standard for missing person investigations across the United States. The mandatory statutory requirements, dictating that professional architectural scans, structural mapping, and forensic evaluations of all crawl spaces, attics, and utility chasms must be executed within the initial 72 hours of a residential disappearance case, prevented countless investigations from stalling out in the traditional dead ends of the past. State task forces utilizing these rigorous protocols successfully resolved several other long-standing regional mysteries, bringing overdue closure to families who had spent decades searching for missing loved ones in the dark. The ghost of Clara Vance, though a tragic catalyst, had inadvertently built an impenetrable shield of accountability that protected future generations. Away from the bureaucratic mechanisms of law enforcement and legal reform, the most profound and enduring dimension of the case's legacy lived on through the tireless, unyielding advocacy of Clara Vance's surviving relatives and the regional foundation they built. What began as a desperate family crusade had evolved into a nationally recognized organization providing critical resources, investigative funding, and psychological support to families grappling with long-term missing persons cases. By bridging the gap between cutting-edge genetic genealogy laboratories and underfunded rural police departments, the foundation catalyzed the resolution of dozens of dormant cold cases across the American South. Every successfully identified victim and every closure delivered to a grieving family stood as a living monument to Clara's memory, ensuring that her untimely loss translated into a powerful force for global healing and truth. The physical boundaries of Elmwood Lane maintained a serene, contemplative dignity. The Memorial Park, anchored by its simple polished granite marker beneath the sprawling branches of the ancient oak tree, remained a quiet sanctuary visited by respectful true crime historians, dedicated forensic students, and empathetic locals. Local authorities maintained a vigilant, protective watch over the grounds, ensuring that the solemnity of the space was shielded from the sensationalist fringes of true crime tourism. Children played on the adjacent sidewalks under the watchful eyes of parents who, while possessing a sober awareness of the world's darker complexities, refused to let fear dictate the joy of daily life. As the midnight hour approached, casting long, peaceful shadows across quiet front porches and peaceful suburban homes, the final, overarching echoes of the 1986 Dallas cold case settled completely and permanently into history. The terrifying narrative of Arthur Pendleton, the soft-spoken draftsman who lived 3 houses down, offered gentle waves, and hid his dark trophies in the dark cavities directly above a victim's head, remained etched into the darkest chapters of American true crime history as a stark warning of the monsters that can walk among us. Yet, as the quiet suburb breathed in the calm night air, the ultimate message of the tragedy stood resolute and eternal, while darkness can conceal itself in the most unexpected places, waiting silently in the shadows. The relentless pursuit of truth possesses the absolute power to pierce the veil, drag hidden secrets into the harsh light of day, and ensure that the victims of the past are never forgotten. As the quiet stillness of the midnight hour slowly yielded to the earliest, tentative brushstrokes of a new dawn, the peaceful residential blocks of Oak Ridge began to stir under a pale, pearlescent sky. The gentle morning breeze swept down Elmwood Lane, carrying the faint, earthy scent of dew-kissed grass and awakening the solemn memorial park that anchored the neighborhood. 10 years and a day had passed since the heavy excavators purged the physical reminders of the tragedy from the earth, yet the profound, overarching echoes of the 1986 cold case continued to resonate far beyond the borders of Texas, leaving an indelible, permanent imprint on the collective consciousness of modern criminal justice, forensic science, and investigative journalism. Inside the high-security archives of the Texas Department of Public Safety headquarters in Austin, the multi-volume case files of Arthur Pendleton remained an indispensable cornerstone of professional training. The comprehensive curriculum developed from the Oak Ridge investigation had become a universal standard across law enforcement academies nationwide, fundamentally transforming how detectives approach domestic disappearances and architectural forensics. Recruits were rigorously taught to discard the comforting assumptions of community trust and surface-level cooperation, learning instead to analyze residential architecture through the cold, objective lens of structural psychology. Every hidden crawlspace, every knee-wall attic, and every uninspected utility duct was now treated as a potential crime scene archive, ensuring that the devastating oversight of 1986 would never be repeated. Across academic institutions, sociologists, criminologists, and forensic psychologists continued to publish groundbreaking research examining the long-term emotional evolution of communities marked by internal betrayal. The concept of retroactive paranoia, the quiet, enduring anxiety that forces residents to reevaluate decades of neighborly interactions, friendly greetings, and casual porch conversations, was widely recognized as a complex, chronic form of communal trauma. Researchers documented how the complete physical demolition of structures like the Vance home served as a necessary catalyst for psychological recovery, even as the intangible fabric of trust required generations to slowly and deliberately mend. The residents of Oak Ridge had adapted, replacing naive complacency with a grounded, watchful awareness that prioritized collective security without surrendering the warmth of daily life. The legislative legacy of the Oak Ridge Protocol stood firmly as the gold standard for missing person investigations across the United States. The mandatory statutory requirements, dictating that professional architectural scans, structural mapping, and forensic evaluations of all crawl spaces, attics, and utility chasms must be executed within the initial 72 hours of a residential disappearance case, prevented countless investigations from stalling out in the traditional dead ends of the past. State task forces utilizing these rigorous protocols successfully resolved several other long-standing regional mysteries, bringing overdue closure to families who had spent decades searching for missing loved ones in the dark. The ghost of Clara Vance, though a tragic catalyst, had inadvertently built an impenetrable shield of accountability that protected future generations. Away from the bureaucratic mechanisms of law enforcement and legal reform, the most profound and enduring dimension of the case's legacy lived on through the tireless, unyielding advocacy of Clara Vance's surviving relatives and the regional foundation they built. What began as a desperate family crusade had evolved into a nationally recognized organization providing critical resources, investigative funding, and psychological support to families grappling with long-term missing persons cases. By bridging the gap between cutting-edge genetic genealogy laboratories and underfunded rural police departments, the foundation catalyzed the resolution of dozens of dormant cold cases across the American South. Every successfully identified victim and every closure delivered to a grieving family stood as a living monument to Clara's memory, ensuring that her untimely loss translated into a powerful force for global healing and truth. The physical boundaries of Elmwood Lane maintained a serene, contemplative dignity. The Memorial Park, anchored by its simple polished granite marker beneath the sprawling branches of the ancient oak tree, remained a quiet sanctuary visited by respectful true crime historians, dedicated forensic students, and empathetic locals. Local authorities maintained a vigilant, protective watch over the grounds, ensuring that the solemnity of the space was shielded from the sensationalist fringes of true crime tourism. Children played on the adjacent sidewalks under the watchful eyes of parents who, while possessing a sober awareness of the world's darker complexities, refused to let fear dictate the joy of daily life. As the morning sun finally crested the horizon, washing the Texas landscape in a brilliant, golden illumination that chased away the final lingering shadows of the night, the definitive narrative of the 1986 Dallas cold case reached its ultimate, unbroken horizon. The terrifying legacy of Arthur Pendleton, the unassuming draftsman who lived 3 houses down, wore the mask of a friendly neighbor and concealed his horrifying acts in the dark structural cavities directly above a victim's living space, remained forever etched into the dark annals of American true crime history as an eternal reminder of the vigilance required to protect the innocent. Yet, as the quiet suburb fully awakened to the promise of a new day, the absolute message of the tragedy stood resolute, unshakable, and eternal. While darkness can hide in the most unexpected corners of domestic life, the relentless, unyielding pursuit of truth will always possess the power to shatter the silence, drag hidden atrocities into the harsh light of justice, and ensure that those who are lost are never, ever forgotten. As the bright, golden light of morning fully illuminated the tranquil suburban blocks of Oak Ridge, casting long, crisp shadows across the manicured lawns and quiet streets of Elmwood Lane, the neighborhood breathed with a deep, steady sense of enduring peace. At the center of the community, the small memorial park surrounding the polished granite marker of Clara Vance stood in quiet dignity, catching the gentle morning breeze rustling through the lush, emerald canopy of the ancient oak tree. More than a decade had passed since the heavy industrial excavators purged the physical reminders of the tragedy from the earth, yet the profound, overarching echoes of the 1986 cold case continued to resonate far beyond the borders of Texas, leaving an indelible, permanent imprint on the collective consciousness of modern criminal justice, forensic science, and investigative journalism. Inside the high-security archives of the Texas Department of Public Safety headquarters in Austin, the multi-volume case files of Arthur Pendleton remained an indispensable cornerstone of professional training. The comprehensive curriculum developed from the Oak Ridge investigation had become a universal standard across law enforcement academies nationwide, fundamentally transforming how detectives approach domestic disappearances and architectural forensics. Recruits were rigorously taught to discard the comforting assumptions of community trust and surface-level cooperation, learning instead to analyze residential architecture through the cold, objective lens of structural psychology. Every hidden crawlspace, every knee-wall attic, and every uninspected utility duct was now treated as a potential crime scene archive, ensuring that the devastating oversight of 1986 would never be repeated. Across academic institutions, sociologists, criminologists, and forensic psychologists continued to publish groundbreaking research examining the long-term emotional evolution of communities marked by internal betrayal. The concept of retroactive paranoia, the quiet, enduring anxiety that forces residents to reevaluate decades of neighborly interactions, friendly greetings, and casual porch conversations, was widely recognized as a complex, chronic form of communal trauma. Researchers documented how the complete physical demolition of structures like the Vance home served as a necessary catalyst for psychological recovery, even as the intangible fabric of trust required generations to slowly and deliberately mend. The residents of Oak Ridge had adapted, replacing naive complacency with a grounded, watchful awareness that prioritized collective security without surrendering the warmth of daily life. The legislative legacy of the Oak Ridge Protocol stood firmly as the gold standard for missing person investigations across the United States. The mandatory statutory requirements, dictating that professional architectural scans, structural mapping, and forensic evaluations of all crawl spaces, attics, and utility chasms must be executed within the initial 72 hours of a residential disappearance case, prevented countless investigations from stalling out in the traditional dead ends of the past. State task forces utilizing these rigorous protocols successfully resolved several other long-standing regional mysteries, bringing overdue closure to families who had spent decades searching for missing loved ones in the dark. The ghost of Clara Vance, though a tragic catalyst, had inadvertently built an impenetrable shield of accountability that protected future generations. Away from the bureaucratic mechanisms of law enforcement and legal reform, the most profound and enduring dimension of the case's legacy lived on through the tireless, unyielding advocacy of Clara Vance's surviving relatives and the regional foundation they built. What began as a desperate family crusade had evolved into a nationally recognized organization providing critical resources, investigative funding, and psychological support to families grappling with long-term missing persons cases. By bridging the gap between cutting-edge genetic genealogy laboratories and underfunded rural police departments, the Foundation catalyzed the resolution of dozens of dormant cold cases across the American South. Every successfully identified victim and every closure delivered to a grieving family stood as a living monument to Clara's memory, ensuring that her untimely loss translated into a powerful force for global healing and truth. The physical boundaries of Elmwood Lane maintained a serene, contemplative dignity. The Memorial Park, anchored by its simple polished granite marker beneath the sprawling branches of the ancient oak tree, remained a quiet sanctuary visited by respectful true crime historians, dedicated forensic students, and empathetic locals. Local authorities maintained a vigilant, protective watch over the grounds, ensuring that the solemnity of the space was shielded from the sensationalist fringes of true crime tourism. Children played on the adjacent sidewalks under the watchful eyes of parents who, while possessing a sober awareness of the world's darker complexities, refused to let fear dictate the joy of daily life. As the morning sun climbed higher into the azure Texas sky, casting a warm, steady illumination across quiet front porches and peaceful suburban homes, the definitive narrative of the 1986 Dallas cold case reached its ultimate, continuous expression. The terrifying legacy of Arthur Pendleton, the unassuming draftsman who lived 3 houses down, wore the mask of a friendly neighbor and concealed his horrifying acts in the dark structural cavities directly above a victim's living space, remained forever etched into the dark annals of American true crime history as an eternal reminder of the vigilance required to protect the innocent. Yet, as the quiet suburb fully embraced the vibrant rhythm of the new day, the absolute message of the tragedy stood resolute, unshakable, and eternal. While darkness can hide in the most unexpected corners of domestic life, the relentless, unyielding pursuit of truth will always possess the power to shatter the silence, drag hidden atrocities into the harsh light of justice, and ensure that those who are lost are never, ever forgotten. As the midday sun reached its absolute zenith, casting a brilliant, uncompromising glare across the asphalt and manicured lawns of Elmwood Lane, the quiet suburban enclave of Oak Ridge maintained its steadfast, meditative rhythm. At the focal point of the neighborhood, the small memorial park surrounding the polished granite marker of Clara Vance stood in profound serenity, catching the warm, midday light filtering through the dense, emerald canopy of the ancient oak tree. More than a decade had slipped away since the heavy industrial excavators purged the physical reminders of the tragedy from the earth, yet the profound, overarching echoes of the 1986 cold case continued to resonate far beyond the borders of Texas, leaving an indelible, permanent imprint on the collective consciousness of modern criminal justice, forensic science, and investigative journalism. Inside the high-security archives of the Texas Department of Public Safety headquarters in Austin, the multi-volume case files of Arthur Pendleton remained an indispensable cornerstone of professional training. The comprehensive curriculum developed from the Oak Ridge investigation had become a universal standard across law enforcement academies nationwide, fundamentally transforming how detectives approach domestic disappearances and architectural forensics. Recruits were rigorously taught to discard the comforting assumptions of community trust and surface-level cooperation, learning instead to analyze residential architecture through the cold, objective lens of structural psychology.